Chapter 11 of The Secret of the Sahara, Kufara by Rosita Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11 The Cities of Kufara. On January 16th, our battles began again. Unfortunately, Hassanein was ill, but he dragged himself up for a last effort. Perhaps success had gone to our heads a little, for not content with visiting Taj and Jaf, the religious center and the seat of government, we had lately made plans for exploring the oasis to its farthest limits. In vain the unfortunate retinue pointed out that it would be another case of Hawawiri. The Zuyas are in 2 cities, they urged. There is nothing in the villages. You can throw a stone into Buma from these walls, so why tire yourselves further? We felt that this sudden thought for our comfort had an ulterior motive, so we pursued the subject. "I should like to see the people," I said to Yusuf. "You will see them all in the souk at Jof. Every week they come in to buy and sell. They are savages, the Zuyas who live on the edge of the oasis, and they are poor people without interest." "Well, I should like to see the western end of the wadi." Yusuf looked puzzled. "But you can see everything in Kufara from this mountain," he said, with some truth. I was reduced to retorting that I could not see the actual houses of Tolab and Zurich. Our fat retainer had a distinct sense of humor. "Nor could you see the houses of Hawawiri from our camp," he reminded. "I want to meet the heads of the Zuyas, and if I go to all the villages, I can talk to them." Yusuf seized upon this happily. "They can come and see you, and then you can ask them about their people." Thus word went forth from the Kaimakan that all the tribal headmen were to come to Taj to meet the important strangers, and the hour and place appointed for this most solemn council were 4 hours before sunset, in the house of Sidi Idris. We had anticipated battle because Abdullah had been absent for 24 hours, and we learned too late that he had been making a tour of the small villages, expounding the treacherous stories which had failed in the Senussi centers, but we did not expect quite such a disastrous meeting. The 15 sheiks who appeared nearly 2 hours late at the rendezvous were weak and convinced that if they carried out their designs they would be acting against the wish of the Sayyids whom they respected and honored. Yet so great was their long-cherished loathing of the stranger, which had been fostered by years of isolation till it was as much a part of their creed as the Shahada or the Zaka, that they were determined at all costs to prevent our penetrating farther into their country. One gradually absorbed something of the mentality of this strange, distrustful people as one sat amidst the circle of the gloomy, suspicious faces. For generations, the Zuyas have been known as a lawless tribe. Originally, they came from the Fezzan by groups of families, each owning a particular headman, but they never seem to have possessed one supreme chief. The 2 most famous of the ancient sheiks were Abdullah Shikari and Hilag, though it was Agil who met Sidi bin Ali as Senussi in Mecca and told him of the strange enclosed land in the center of the Sahara, which the Zuyas had conquered from the enfeebled Tibu. The great ascetic had already set flame to the religious imagination of North Africa from Morocco eastwards, but he knew nothing of southern Libya. Yet he told the half-savage tribesmen that in a wadi near Tizerbo would be found an Iraq tree, from the wood of which the Arabs make their primitive form of toothbrushes. The tree was duly discovered, the miracle announced to the tribe, and, later, Agil went north again to Gebel Akbar and Cyrenaica to offer the allegiance of his people to the great Senussi. Kufara, the original sultanate of the Tibus, had become, since the Zuya conquest some 250 years before, a danger spot to every caravan, for it was a regular stronghold of brigands who lived by plunder. It was a definite custom that all travelers, especially merchants passing through the oasis, should pay darb, a duty which varied according to the value of their merchandise. Otherwise the caravan would be attacked and plundered. Before the coming of the Senussi, there were only palms in the oasis, and the tribesmen were content with the most primitive clothes, hardly better than those of the skin-clad Tibus. It was Sidi el-Mahdi who introduced the jird and the juba. The dawn of civilization came with the equans sent by Sidi bin Ali, But the Mahdi made Kufara the wonderland it is today, and by extensive planting started the cultivation of grain, fruit, and flowers. Sidi Idris owes some of his influence among the Zuyas to the fact that he is the great Mahdi's son, though his own strong personality counts for much in a land where striking individuality is rare. Under the Senussi government, the Zuyas were obliged to give up their organized brigandage, but with such a long history of murder and plunder behind them, half the tragedies of the Sahara may be laid at their door, it is not to be wondered at that they are still lawless and wild. Every man fears them, and only a power as great as the Senussi could hold them in check. They were practically infidels before they made their submission to Sidi bin Ali, having very nearly lapsed from Islam, though, as they come from Yemen, they probably formed part of the armies who followed Beni Sulim in the 11th century, from Midian through Syria and Egypt to Cyrenaica, where some tribes settled, notably the Abadat, Hassan, Fayed, Brasha, Hosha, Abd, Al-Qahir, and Mogharba. With the fierce religious fanaticism which they absorbed fresh from the fervent ascetics who were enthusiastically preaching a new, pure Islam, were mixed a hatred and scorn of all who had not received this teaching. He who is not with us is against us was interpreted literally, and the land was closed against the stranger, be he Christian or Moslem. It was easy, therefore, to understand the attitude of the white-robed figures who crouched immobile around one end of the long room. They felt that they were defending not only their jealously hidden country, but their religion from the strangers whom they hated and feared. In their hearts they could not believe that the greatly revered Sayyids had authorized our journey. Continual distrust and suspicion are bad daily companions. They had marred and lined the brooding faces round us, till there was little left of the frank, fearless Bedouin. On one side sat Hamad Bukhariam, son of the man who had saved Rolfs, his dark, narrow face set in mute obstinacy. In front of us was Sheikh Suleiman Bu Matar, the only spot of color in the group, for he wore a brilliant orange robe under his jird, and Bush Naf el Garad, an old man with a gray beard who occasionally poured a little oil on the troubled waters. Others present were Sheikh Badr and Mabruk Bu Hilayeg. The whole assembly had made up its mind to oppose us, and they would listen to no argument. "Khalas, it is ended, it is ended. Of what use further speech?" they cried. "If you have a letter from Sidi Idris saying that you are to visit all our villages by name, then you shall go," said Bukhariam. "You know that we have the Sayyid's permission to visit Kufara. No traveler can set foot beyond Jedabiyah without it. Do you think we should have risked certain death? We know that no one can hope to visit even the outskirts of your country without the consent of Sidi Idris, but we are his guests." They changed their ground. "You have seen Kufara," urged Suleiman Bu Matar. "Jaf and Taj are the Markas, center of government. The villages are not interesting. There are no zawiyas even." Argument was useless, for none dared give way before the others. We saw that one or two were weakening out of respect for the fact that we were guests of their rulers, but the old inherited instinct welded them together. Generally, it would be impossible to get 15 Arabs to remain united against strong arguments for a quarter of an hour, but we were fighting a principle as profoundly part of their existence as food and drink. "Khalas, khalas," resounded from every side, and without even waiting for the usual ceremony of tea drinking, the meeting rose hurriedly. "We have spoken," they said, "and argument is of no avail. If you go at your own risk," added Sheikh Badr. Yet before the last flow of protest, they had read the Fatha altogether to show that they honored the Sayyid in the persons of his guests. So the strange council of impulse and reason came to an end, and, as the last white-robed figure fumbled for its shoes at the edge of the matted loggia, Hassanine turned to me despondently. "We have failed absolutely," he said. I would not agree. The guests had come to us strong, with a great resolve, wound up to battle pitch, each man determined to support the others. Now they would separate, and each alone would have the nasty cold feel of wondering what he had done and what the final result of his action would be. "Wait," said I. "Very soon they will feel that they have shown us how dangerous it is to cross their borders, and they will only remember in whose house they met us." Later in the afternoon, a Mojabra merchant, Tawati Haifan, cousin of our old friend Shiab, and one of the Ekwans, Sayed Mohammed Semem, visited us, partly to welcome and partly to console us for the behavior of the Zuyas. "They are bad people," they said. "They have always been like that." Then sunset came, and with it the summons to dinner in the house of many courts. The Wadi of Kufara is always beautiful, but at sunset it is magical, for the girdle of strange hills glows with wonderful mauve and violet lights, and the oasis lies half in shadow where blend the emerald and sapphire of palm and lake, half in flame where the burning sands reflect the glory of the sky. It used to make me catch my breath with the ever new surprise as I came out of the discreet little door in the wake of the ebony slave, who took a great interest in the state of my appetite, and never could understand why I could not cope with 3 separate breakfasts sent to me by as many hosts. I never realized more fully the remoteness of Kufara than when, after the deft-handed slaves had spirited away the huge brass tray, and with it every trace of our meal, we sat motionless beside our host in the long shadowed room, while he silently and very slowly made his carefully prepared tea. The many high-walled courts produced a silence in that dim room of thick carpets and rare lights, as profound as the stillness of the desert. Words, even smiles, would have been out of place during the little ceremony, while rosewater or mint was being measured gravely by the sensitive figures of our host. Beyond the circle of light cast by a solitary candle in a high silver sconce were only vague forms of cushions or huge chests looming in remote corners. Within it was a dark, thin-faced young sheikh, all in white, from his silken kufiya to his flowing jird, and beside him our grave, reflective host, with a vivid green shawl bordered in purple framing his bronze face and drooping over a long green jubba, which showed the richly embroidered sadari beneath. A jeweled hand slowly poured drop after drop of essence into the amber glasses, while the scented smoke of a little brazier drifted gently across the picture. One heard time pause to catch the shadows of the thoughts that wavered between the light and the dark, so mystic was the silence. Then, suddenly and startlingly clear, came the sound that perfected the harmony, the cry of the muezzin for the evening prayer. Next day, a small and somewhat forlorn party descended one of the steep defiles into the wadi. It consisted of Hassanein and myself, mounted on microscopic, yet exceedingly unruly donkeys, the commandant of the gendarmerie, resplendent in pale gray uniform, slashed and faced with red and an immense tasseled kufiya, with 4 fully armed soldiers and a most picturesque Zuya sheikh, Mohammed Taifata, the only tribesman who was brave enough to accompany us. He was splendidly mounted on a white Arab horse, curved of neck and long of pastern, with a scarlet saddle, bow-pommeled, 5 different colored saddlecloths, and silver stirrups, rather like sharp coal scuttles. Kufara is narrow at the eastern end, and with a break in the southern wall of the cliff where a broad space runs out beyond Zurich, it widens gradually as it goes west. The main mass of palms begins between Joff and Taj and sweeps west to Talak, but there are several isolated groups, of which those of Boima and Buma are the largest. We rode first eastward, along the foot of the cliffs, and I realized as we ambled through thick, pale coral sand that if one wishes to keep the impression of an enchanted valley, one should never leave the heights. There are beautiful spots in the valley where palm and tamarisk and rush blend their shades of green beside some unruffled lake, but it is from above that one grasps the whole wonder of water and wood and decorative dark-walled towns, set in the close circle of jeweled hills. As we neared Boima, its few houses, large square or oblong blocks of reddish purple, standing just below the northern cliffs a little apart from its gardens, The sheik grew very nervous. White figures came out to look at us, and he urged us away, but I wanted a photograph. Let no one imagine it is easy to manage a wild toy donkey, keep one's face completely hidden, and secrete about one's pocketless person 2 Kodaks and a spare roll of films. The oasis at Boma is lovely, for various kinds of thorn, a few dark green olives, tamarisks, acacias, and the feathery gray trees described as firewood, all mingled their foliage with the clustered palms. A kilometer away is Boma. At one end of the oasis are a few poor dwellings of the slaves who tend the gardens, some of them made of palms, some of uneven sand bricks. At the other there is a village of the usual dark houses, while a lovely turquoise lake bordered with high rushes lies in the center. On the southern shore, where there is a stretch of rough, dry, salt waste, we found the ruins of a large Tibu fort. These ancient people chose their sites well, for this high, round honeycomb stood on the very edge of the water, its gray, broken walls one with the salt stone that surrounded it and made passage difficult from the land. There were 1 or 2 of the small, round oven houses scattered near the lake, and we wondered if Boma had been the capital of the old Tibu Kufara, then called Tazer, for this fort was bigger than anything at Busima, but roofless and windowless as usual. From the plantations of pumpkins, radishes, parsnips, onions, with neatly irrigated patches of wheat and barley, we drove our escort south down the long, flat stretch of gravelly sand to Zurich, a long strip of palms chiefly owned by Sidi Idris and other Sayyids. There is no village in this southernmost oasis. It is inhabited only by the Sudani slaves who look after the dates. We stopped at a palm leaf fence to ask a huge ebony figure in a tattered white shirt for some dates. He dived into his plaited leaf tukul, reminiscent of the Sudan, and reappeared with a gourd full of large, dry, purplish dates, mixed with lemon-colored unripe ones that the Arabs eat to quench their thirst. We rode the whole length of Zurich's palms, for by this time the Zuya had laid aside his suspicions and was becoming confidential. We asked him how long ago his people had come to Kufara, and he replied, "My father, my grandfather, and his father have all lived here, but before then the tribe came. Sheikh Mohammed was 56, so we gathered that the conquest had taken place some 150 years ago. It is a pathetic thing that the Tibus are disappearing from the wadi even faster than the traces of their odd round houses. Only a few years ago there were about 500 of these dark-skinned, round-faced people, with smooth hair, broad nostrils, and wide mouths, but devoid of the thick negroid lips. Now there are between 50 and 100. Nearly all of them live in a palm leaf village with a few round mud hovels on the outskirts of Jaf. They are more pastoral in habit than the Arabs, so in spite of their debased position as employees of the Zuyas, they own a good many goats and sheep and a few camels. There is practically no pasturage in the wadi, only a little coarse grass or rushes by the lakes, and sparse tufts of the brown mossy hatab that we saw at Busima. Therefore, there are very few flocks indeed, and milk and meat are luxuries except among the prosperous Ekwan of Taj. Fresh water is not plentiful, for there are no springs. There is absolutely no rainfall. Sometimes for 8 consecutive years there is not a single shower. All the gardens are irrigated from wells, but slave labor is abundant. Yet Kufara in summer must be a veritable Eden. From her grapes she makes the sweet vinegar we drank at banquets, and from her roses the essence dropped into our tea, as well as the heavier perfume used in the braziers. She has olives for oil, almonds, lemons, figs, melons, and peaches. Her leather comes from the Sudan, and the shoemakers in Jaf fashion delightful red heelless shoes of soft, pliable hide without nails, but with thongs to bind round the ankles. The Tibus make baskets and rope from the palm leaves, but there is no weaving. The rich clothes of the princely Ekwan, which were our envy and admiration, came from Egypt. Before the war, there were many caravans. One came nearly every day, which means that one was nearly always within the confines of the oasis, perhaps a weekly arrival. Now there are very few, said Sheikh Mohammed. We learned that when a caravan came from the Sudan, it consisted of 150 camels, belonging to perhaps a dozen different merchants, who brought ivory, feathers, sandals, leather. But the smuggling of slaves had been difficult, since the stringent French law had decreed that the whole caravan should be confiscated if one slave were found in it. As a matter of fact, we had been 37 days on the route from Jeddah, and we had not met a single caravan from Wadai, nor did any arrive while we were in Kufara. But this may have been partly due to the fact that the Bedouins preferred traveling in summer, when they can march all night and sleep most of the day. They can go farther this way without suffering from the intense cold of the winter dawn. Also, the winter is the foaling time for camels in Libya, which makes traveling precarious. There is a large market in Joff twice a week, to which people come from as far off as Hawari and Tolab to barter pigeons, eggs, fowls, girbas, and foodstuffs. Slaves are not now sold in the public square on Mondays and Thursdays, but many a human bargain is arranged in the shuttered houses around it. For 100 medjidies one can buy a man, and for 200 a woman, but young girls of 14 and 15 fetch up to 250 medjidies, nearly 50 pounds. These be high prices, said the Zuia despondently, but the people in Barca have bought many slaves lately, and there are fewer caravans. We learned that the Tuaregs of the West had regular slave farms where they bred and sold human beings as we do cattle. You can see 60 slaves in one farm, said our guardian sheikh. As an instance of how uncivilized were the Zuias before the coming of the Sanusi, they told us that a certain Sheikh Mohammed Sharif went to Benghazi, the end of the world, and came back with an oil lamp, which was looked upon as a miracle by the tribesmen of Kufara. By the power of a little kerosene, he ruled them for years, giving judgments and discovering malefactors by interpreting its light. Deep in conversation, we skirted the rough, rocky ground to the south of the broad belt of Joff palms and came to Talak, at the end of the emerald maze where Sayyid Ahmed owns many gardens. A whole colony of slaves dwelt in clusters of tukals within neat palm leaf fences, and there were some biggish houses of sand bricks on whose flat roofs masses of dates were drying in the sun. The afternoon was far advanced by this time, but the Zuia was anxious to show us the beauty spot of the oasis, so we rode through the thickest palm groves between mounds of gray bushes until quite suddenly we came to a little round lake, whose still water reflected every frond of the palms drooping round it under the shadow of high amber banks which shut in the pool on every side, so that duck sported on it peacefully without fear of onlookers. It was a lovely picture, with the rose-red hills in the distance, but we were glad to turn our donkeys' heads homewards, and still gladder when the massive houses of Taj appeared on the most precipitous cliff in the distance. The names of the villages in Kufara are interesting, for whereas Taj means very suitably a crown, and Joff inside, Zuruk and Tolab are the names of 2 tribes which are still to be found in Egypt. Sheikh Mohammed told us that they had helped the Zuias to conquer the unfortunate Tibu, and had received the places bearing their names as their share of the spoil. Later, however, they had grown tired of the remote valley and of the endless disputes between Zuias and Tibus, which lasted till the coming of the Sanusi, and had returned to their own country. January 18th saw the virtual end of our pilgrimage. As we took leave of Sidi Salah after our 3rd cup of mint tea, he asked us if we would like to visit the Zawiya of the Asayad. Daily we had passed the massive block of buildings from which generally issued the sound of the chanted Koran. We knew that inside those formidable walls was the Quba of the Mahdi, a symbol only, for the Sanusi believe their saint still living, but nevertheless the goal of all Sanusi pilgrims and the object of almost as much veneration as the tomb of the Prophet. In the course of slow, dignified conversation, with a correct proportion of prolonged silences, we had delicately approached the subject of visiting the revered shrine, but no other sanction than "Inshallah" had been vouchsafed us. Time and date are never suggested in the East. Thus, we had to wait patiently till the Kaimakan was satisfied that the suitable moment had come. We passed through the large, low mosque which joined the Zawiya. Rows of great, square, whitewashed pilasters supported the heavy wooden palm trunks forming the beams of the flat roof. It was utterly unadorned, and the mimbar was of the simplest description, without paint or carving. Yet, for a moment, as I stood on the threshold of the Holy of Holies of a great warrior confraternity, austere and fanatical, I forgot the troubles and dangers of a long journey. I understood something of the awe and reverence of any other shoeless pilgrim, who, after much travel, steps at last from the white mats of the mosque into the dim chamber where he will kiss the sacred Kaaba. For the first time I realized the great peace which comes at a journey's end, yet the long, narrow room was unlike our Western idea of a shrine. Nearly the whole of the floor space was occupied by the graves of members of the Sanusi family, oblongs of desert sand with a stone edging and an upright slab at either end. A narrow, carpeted pathway ran round these to the farthest corner, where stood the Kaaba of Mahdi, an arc-shaped wooden framework covered with a red cloth. As befits a creed which forbids all luxury, the simplicity of the room was striking. There was nothing to impress the pilgrim except his own passionate reverence. His worship must, of necessity, be a thing of the spirit, and not of the senses. Yet that low, dim chamber in the middle of the Sahara is in its way as impressive as St. Peter's at Rome or the Temple of Heaven in Pekin. Cardinals and mandarins may bring mixed motives to their worship, but the fierce-eyed Bedouin in rough white burnous, worn wooden rosary hanging from sun-dried fingers, prays with a strenuous simplicity and earnestness that must impress the very atmosphere with the sincerity of his devotion. Thus I felt, as, hands raised to heaven, I murmured the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim under keen watching eyes. But when we passed out into the sunlight, the impression faded and one's guard was up again. First there was a fight with the blacks, who had become hopelessly unruly. Having been only remarkable for their absence when there was any real danger, they now devoted their time to eating, sleeping, and talking of their prowess. We, therefore, decided to send them back to Jallo by the main caravan route, and go on ourselves to Jagabub. This time the retinue protested in vain. We had suffered too much from their fears coming in to wish to return through the continual minor panics of the Zuya country. The Jagabug route is considerably shorter, for it cuts off the angle of Jallo, and above all, it is utterly unknown to Europeans. As it necessitates at least 12 days without water, some 600 kilometers, it is rarely attempted except by very large, well-equipped caravans who can afford to lose a few camels by the way, or by the Sanusi family, who can send camels laden with water on ahead to fill some reservoirs especially placed for the purpose. We had seen the dangers of traveling with a moderately large and inefficient retinue, so we now determined to try the other extreme. We proposed to take with us only Mohammed and Yusuf, a guide and perhaps a camel-man. We should have to take 4 camels for water alone, and another 2 at least for fodder, before we could think of luggage and provisions. The latter are easy, for it is of no use providing for more than 17 days at the outside after leaving Hawawiri. If by that time the traveler is not safely in Jagabub, he is dead, for there are no wells on the route after leaving Zakar, 3 days from Hawawiri. Altogether, it would be an exciting journey, and looking at the blank white space on our survey map, where not even Zakar was marked, we longed to put a long red line across it. Caravans from Egypt should logically do the Jagabub route, unless they go direct from Siwa, which means an extra half day without water. The alternative is 7 days to Jallo, 1 to Butterfall, and then 7 to Zegan, and a further 5 to Hawawiri. The worst point in the more direct route is that there are 4 days of bad dunes just before reaching Jagabub. However, anything was preferable to trying to keep the peace between the Bedouins and Sudanese for 3 weeks, with the accompanying tale of sore feet and overladen camels, water squandered, fuel all used during the first few days, and doubtless a delay at each well. We spent most of the morning arguing with the soldiers, who all apparently wanted to get married at Jagabub, probably on the reward they hoped to get for accompanying us there. Then the visitors began to arrive, which proved that the mental atmosphere was changing. The chilly, doubtful feeling I had predicted was beginning to trouble the Zuyas, who had so stormily swept from our presence 2 days before. The dark Hamid Bukuriam was the first to come. He had been one of the loudest to denounce the strangers. Now he said, "I wanted all the men to come out and meet you with drums, but there was dissension. What you said at the meeting was true, but it would not have been good for me to have agreed with you then. I was obliged to support the others, for we had arranged what we were going to say beforehand." This was a poor specimen of Arab mentality, but he was followed by an entirely different type, Suleiman Bumatar, old and much traveled, very devoted to the Sanusi family. At the original meeting he had been calm and suave, only saying that we should waste time by going to the villages. Now he said with very quiet dignity, "Your words were wise, but you must not judge the people here by your own countrymen. Egypt is the mother of the world. The villagers here are very ignorant." He then offered to accompany us to the other end of the oasis. Thereafter the retinue were somewhat less frightened, and we went to Joff without difficulty. We rode along a little causeway which crossed the big curly lake in the midst of the Joff palm gardens, and when we came to the rough salt marsh on the farther side, we found the ruins of a whole Tibu village. Some of the houses were amazingly small, but very well preserved, the hard mortar smooth and always polished on the outside, looking exactly like round clay ovens. As at Buma, on the very edge of the water, was a castle. It appeared that the Tibus fought only with spears, so a strip of water was a good protection against attack. Therefore, wherever there is a lake in the Kufara or Bosima oasis, one is pretty certain to find the ruins of villages and primitive forts. The Zuyas won an easy victory because they had guns and gunpowder. Joff is a large native town stretching for about 1 kilometer in a line of solid, long walls without door or window. At one end is the old Zawiya established by the Ekwan of Sidi Ben Ali. It is an insignificant building, very low, with a dark, bare mosque, large and very well kept, and in the further room the Quba of the daughters of Sidi el-Mahdi. This tomb is enclosed in a green wooden frame and hung with quantities of ostrich eggs. It is much venerated, and in one of the courts we saw some pilgrims from Waidai, fierce-looking blacks with rosaries and long palm staves. The whole life of an Arab town goes on within the high, impenetrable walls. Otherwise, they are cities of the dead. I doubt if we saw a dozen figures in the streets of Joff till we came to the Tibu settlement, yet it has a population of some 700. The women literally never set foot outside their houses. The whole time I was in Taj, I never saw a woman except 1 or 2 elderly black slaves. It must be an extraordinary life within a few square feet bounded by blind walls. The ladies of the Sayed's families can visit each other perhaps, as in Taj the houses of the Sanusi family are adjoining. But I have never been in any eastern town where life was so reserved and aloof. Presumably the men gossip, but if they do it in each other's houses, for one never sees a group in the streets. Very occasionally one notices a grave figure with a brass ewer or humble teapot, performing the necessary ablution at sunset before saying the obligatory prayers, or perhaps a reflective gray-bearded individual standing at an open door. The great difference between the Sanusi towns and any other desert city is the entire absence in the former of the cafes, which usually form the center of life and movement. They vary in size and splendor, but from Omdurman to Touggourt, one finds in every village at least a mud-walled room with rough benches and little tables, or in the more primitive places merely a raised ledge running around the wall, where all the menfolk gossip over long-stemmed nargilahs, while generally a dancer performs some variation of the danse du ventre. In Libya, smoking, drinking, and dancing girls are forbidden by the Senussi law. Therefore, the café had no raison d'être, and the towns are silent, apparently deserted, infinitely discreet. We rode all around the scattered masses of Joff's houses, meeting Sheib's brother, Ahmed el-Qadri, a well-known Senussi clerk, who greeted us warmly and was delighted to get news of his family. Then we climbed the little group of gourds beyond the town and looked down upon the Tibu village whose headman is Saad el-Tibu. Very primitive were the dwellings after the solid Zuya buildings, for the greater part were just palm-leaf huts. The men were generally tall and clad in sheepskins, the wool worn inside. Their food, when they travel, consists of powdered locusts and powdered dates mixed together. The women wore only one long dark piece of stuff, wound round them like a barakan, but generally tattered and somewhat inadequate. The young ones were distinctly pretty, with charming round faces, wide long-lashed eyes, almost black skins, but without any of the swollen negroid characteristics. As we rode back across the wadi, I discovered the right adjective for the cliffs of Kufara. Of course they were amber, a rich mellow amber, which detracted from the green of the palms, so that the gardens of Joff took on a wonderful silvery gray appearance against the burnt gold of the hills. That night, while meticulously measuring the just proportion of tea, sugar, and spice, the Kaimakan offered to show us an original letter of Sidi bin Ali as-Senussi to the people of Wajanga on the road to Wadai. I think our enthusiastic interest pleased him, for he at once detached an immense key from his belt and gave it to a slave, who brought a casket not much bigger than the key. This was placed solemnly in the circle of light on the dark piled carpets, and in the almost tangible silence that seemed to reign within that house, Sidi Saleh reverently drew forth a single sheet of rough quarto paper, 3/4 of which was covered with minute, old-fashioned Arabic. I give the literal translation in the appendix because the letter is of historical importance, as it announces the Senussi's intention of accepting the allegiance of the Zuyas, of coming to Kufara with a tacit understanding that his rule would be accepted so far south of Wajanga. It was an exceedingly interesting document, and one fully appreciated its value in the exotic houses of Sidi bin Abd in the middle of the legendary oasis. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. The Secret of the Sahara, Kufara, by Rosita Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Flight from Taj. Thereafter, we settled down for a day or two to the reserved and placid life of Taj. We got up shortly after sunrise, and while there was yet no sign of movement among the dark, discreet walls, we wandered miles along the cliffs, trying to get the exact positions of the various oases and villages. The latter are almost invisible in some lights, as they are made of the sand and stones amidst which they stand. We found that the wadi narrowed to a strip to the northeast beyond Boama, while to the west it widened out into a wide expanse of hatab, high mounds covered with sticks and leafless bushes. To the southwest, these hillocks rose from 12 to 20 feet, and then beyond Tolab, which was too far away to be seen from our cliffs, the hatab gradually merged into the flat desert. One morning we explored the whole of the salt marsh, from whose hard gray stony matter the Tibus had built their houses. We found the remains of a whole village, though some of the houses were but broken circles on the ground. The main fort had one chamber 16 feet in diameter, and the highest bit of wall existing measured 11 feet.
but round it was a crumbled mass of walls and smaller rooms, or separate buildings perhaps, as each was neatly finished off with perfectly rounded surface, like the damp clay pots one sees made on a rotary wheel. I think the Tibus must have found the salt, hard sand, especially good for their very enduring mortar, for their ruined villages are to be found only on marshes, as at Busima, Buma, and Jaf. When we heard that there were Tibu remains in Tizerbo and actual Tibus in Ribiana, we instantly concluded that there were marshes in these two oases, and the idea proved correct. When we returned from our matutinal walks, we had enough appetite to cope with Sidi Salah's prodigious hospitality. Every morning, on the stroke of 9, a light tap came on my green and yellow door, and there was Durer, with smiling ebony face, ready to lead us by sandy path and intricate court and passage to the wide carpeted loggia, where waited our kindly host, to wave us into the long, dark chamber redolent of roses and cinnamon. After we had gravely washed our hands in the Damascus basin, we crouched cross-legged beside the immense brass tray, and there was a moment of thrilled expectation while another slave lifted the lids of a dozen dishes. Sometimes there was a small carved tray inlaid with silver, on which stood half a score of bowls of sweetmeats, stiff blancmanges of all colors, adorned with almonds, very sweet paste, something like Yorkshire pudding, junket made of the milk of a newly lambing sheep, all sorts of date concoctions, couscous made with raisins and sugar, a white sticky cream flavored with mint. Always there were bowls of sweet hot milk and piles of thin, crisp, heavy bread, fried with butter and eaten hot with sugar, called in Egypt bread of the judge. Arab custom ordains that a guest must be entertained for 3 days and 3 nights, but the generous Kaimakan would not hear of our getting anything for ourselves. The story of Jedediah was repeated over again. Once we protested about the mighty meals provided in the house of Sidi al-Abd, and the next day, as a reminder that the hospitality of the East is unbounded and must be accepted with the simplicity with which it is offered, the number of dishes was doubled, and there were no fewer than 20 loaves ranged round the tray, while the center plat was no longer a bowl, it was literally a bath of mellow golden rice, in which lay the buttery fragments of a whole sheep. 2 hours each morning were spent in that quiet room, going through the various ceremonies dependent on breakfasting. When the highly spiced and peppered coffee was finished, there were always the 3 glasses of green tea, hot and strong, with dignified, slow conversation punctuated by many pauses, while the brazier smoke made little hypnotic spirals, and through the open door a splash of sunlight crept over the castellated walls and lingered on the purple and rose of the carpets between the great arches of the loggia. About 11 o'clock, scented and very replete, we took ceremonious leave of our host and departed slowly, but the instant the doors of Sidi Idris's house closed on the last alaikum salam of the departing slave, we dropped the ponderous and reflective gait suited to our exalted position and ran across the great court to shut ourselves up in the harem, the only really private bit of the house, with pencils and paper. How we regretted, as we struggled with angles and degrees, the perverse distrust with which the Zuias regard even a compass. We used to have the most frantic arguments about our primitive maps, but Hassanein was nearly always right as to direction, and I as to distance, fruit of so many long journeys in the desert, where all landmarks appear 3 times as near as they really are. We worked solidly till 4 or 5, though there were nearly always interruptions. Mohammed, to say we should have to buy a camel man for 20 pounds and sell him again at Jagabub. Yusuf, to say the Girbas still leaked after all his cunning treatment. Little Sidi Omar, resplendent in a wonderful yellow jubba, to hint about the scarcity of pocket knives in Kufara. Sheikh Musa from Hawari to tell us that the men of his village were too overawed to visit us in the house of the Sayyids, but were exceedingly regretful concerning their reception of us. So the hot hours wore away, and about 5 we wandered out to see the amazing sunsets over the wadi, when, for a few minutes, the whole oasis was dyed in rainbow flames. Generally, before the crimson disk had sunk beyond the western sands, Surur was anxiously scanning the landscape to announce the dinner hour. We had long ago lost count of European time. We used vaguely to calculate that the sun rose at 6 a.m. and set at 6 p.m., but for all practical purposes we followed the Arab day, which begins an hour after sunset. We set our watches each evening to solar time and found ourselves counting and changing months by the lunar year of Islam. I never knew what day of the week it was till Friday came, when, if we were in a town, we joined the stream of worshippers clad in their best clothes who wended their way to the mosque. In the desert, the most learned would recite the Koran and read a simple form of prayer. While the muezzin was crying the melodious call to prayer, La ilaha illallah, Hayya ala salah, Hayya ala falah, from the round tower at the end of the Zawiya wall, we passed between the shuttered houses, gravely greeting the few white-shrouded forms who crossed our path. As the last appealing yet triumphant Allahu Akbar rang out to the evening star, we entered the first low door, and the oppressive secrecy of the house shut us in. How many cloistered lives were hidden behind the little wooden shutters that never opened for dark-fringed eyes to peer shyly at the passing strangers. Sometimes little Sidi Omar ran out to kiss my hand and say, "On my head and my eyes I love you." Sometimes we saw a long row of red leather slippers before one of the smaller porches, and caught a glimpse of white figures bent over a huge platter from which, with a right thumb and 2 fingers, it is very bad form to dirty more of the hand than this, they ate rapidly. Otherwise, the house kept its secrets well, and we never knew who lived in it or how. After the evening meal, the atmosphere mellowed with a candlelight and mint tea. Our host talked to us of the Sayyids he served, of their great history and their influence. We learned that Sidi Ahmed as-Sharif was respected and revered as the supporter of the old regime. He stood for the stern, unbending laws of the first Senussi. His judgments were ruthlessly severe and rapidly executed, as in the case of the unfortunate Mukhtar. The malefactor saw only a stately white figure, completely veiled, and from behind the snowy cloth came the immutable words of judgment. Sayyid Ahmed broke men, he never bent them. Yet the older Equan, serious and simple, venerated him because to them he represents the power of tradition, the inviolate Islam, fanatically opposed to European progress. On the other hand, Sidi Idris is loved. As the son of the Mahdi, the Senussi saint, the wonder of whose works and words is rapidly becoming legendary, he inherits a great power. The Bedouin likes to worship something tangible under Allah. He must feel convinced that there is one being on earth who blends spiritual and temporal power so that he himself can dwell in a sort of mystic security. Insha'Allah, and if our Lord Idris wills it, is an oft-repeated phrase. The emir has a reputation for justice and patience. The former is as stringent and as merciless as that of his predecessor, but it is tempered with the infinite patience always taken to ensure the whole of the case being examined before judgment is given. This is essential in a land where the justice of the Quran is the only code. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Drunkenness is punished by flogging. The thief loses his right hand. Treachery means death. Sidi Idris is too good a Moslem and too great a mystic not to have secured the wholehearted devotion of his father's followers, while his broad-minded and intelligent foreign policy has secured him the respect of the modern element. The accord at Regima was one of the greatest triumphs. It showed his power in Cyrenaica. The tribal sheiks of the coast, almost without exception, announced, "The word of Idris is ours." The closing scene of our day will always be connected in my mind with the chanting of the Quran in the Zawiya and the most brilliant clear starlight as we returned to our house in silence, only broken by the soft shuffling of our heelless slippers in the sand. While the cold white light warred with our candles and the melodious words of the book were still humming in our ears, visitors would gradually make their appearance. The judge, Osman Quadi, Mahmud el-Jadawi, the Wakil, a few of the more advanced Ikhwan, among whom was Muhammad Tawati, close friend of the Mahdi. The last named is partially paralyzed, and the Sanusi mind, always alert for signs and miracles, explains that, in defiance of the direct orders of Sidi el-Rifi, the unfortunate man started to journey north. Before he reached Tawari, his camel died, and he himself was stricken with paralysis. In those dim evenings, while I made scented tea, the talk was a little less formal. We learned how much the Mahdi had done for Kufara, for besides giving it flowers, fruit, and vegetables, he introduced pigeons and duck and the cultivation of grain. He built the fortress sanctuary of Taj, where the wells are 90 feet deep, so that water is always scarce and a girba full is a gift, since 2 hefty slaves have to wind up the heavy buckets foot by foot. The site is well chosen, but the town depends for its life on an army of slaves. For every vegetable or flower, every date and piece of firewood must be carried up from the wadi below. The fuel is dry hatab and huge palm leaves. There is also charcoal made in the valley. The Mahdi instituted the regular caravan route to Wadai and encouraged a very extensive trade between the Sudan and Cyrenaica. He miraculously discovered wells on the southern route, and old Sheikh Suleiman Bumatar told how his father had been with the Seit when the water failed the caravan at Sahara on the way to Wadai. The Sanusi leader pointed to a spot which appeared to be solid rock and bade the men dig. Hour after hour they labored till the well had sunk beyond the sight of the watchers up above. Only their faith in the Mahdi could have made possible so gigantic a task, for the water did not appear till almost the inconceivable depth of 120 kamas, the length of a man's forearm and hand from elbow to first knuckles. Only a man with amazing eyesight can see the water, and the rope is unending, said Sheikh Suleiman. We learned a list of the prices in Kufara from a ponderous merchant whose striped brown and yellow jerd reminded one of biblical pictures. Hajan, trotting camels, all of which belonged to the Tibus, cost 17 to 18 pounds in gold. Sheep were 5 medjidies, goats 4.5, fowls half a medjidi, and pigeons 4.5 kurash. Eggs were very cheap, 100 for a medjidi, 2 a penny, but sugar was 2 medjidis an oak, 8 shillings for 2 pounds, and tea 3 medjidis an oak. Butter fetched 2 medjidis for 3 rotals, 1 pound. Practically no other produce is sold. The owners of the gardens keep their vegetables for themselves. Mahmud el-Jadawi volunteered much information about dates. This year the grazing is good in Barca, so you may buy several camel loads for a medjidi. But when there is no grass in the north, the Zuis come here with large caravans and buy all our dates, so that for a medjidi you can purchase but a few rotals. He added that many tons of the Sayyid's dates were even now rotting, as there were no camels to take them away. I have noticed that there are very few camels in Kufara, I said. There are very few men also, he replied. The Zuis have taken all their camels to Barca this year to feed them on the good grass. They do this every winter when the Nagas are foaling, as there is no fodder here. They leave their families in Kufara and come back to them in the summer. I used to get very sleepy before the last visitor departed, having generally urgently urged us not to do the Jagabab route. They are the most depressing of Job's comforters with regard to journeys, for they always remember terrible stories of death from thirst or loss of direction, which they relate with infinite detail. Thus, we learned that the Gebel Fadil, on the east of the Zigan route, was so called because some 20 years ago one Jebel Fadil had missed the well at Zigan on his way from Jallo and had perished in the mountains with all his family. Concerning the Jagabab route, the most encouraging sentence was generally, "If you miss it, you go either to Siwa or to hell," uttered in a tone that left no doubt as to which was the more probable. We had secured the only guide in the place, Suleiman, and we had ascertained that he really had done the journey 4 years before, and that previous to that he had done it with Yusuf. He was a little, quiet old man, bent and gray, of few words. When we asked him the length of the journey, he said, "Wallahi, I cannot tell. My walk is 12 days from Zakar, but I do not know your walk." We assured him with the utmost fervor that our walk would almost certainly be the twin brother of his own, but personally, I thought the whole caravan would probably sit down and die of complete inanition. Hassanein and I had never yet managed to walk a whole 12 hours on end. Mohammed had nearly died in the attempt. Yusuf had grown fat and soft again on the rich fare of Taj, while Suleiman looked much too ancient and frail for such a stupendous march. Our weakness was equaled only by that of the animals, for the best had all foaled, and only the young, unreliable Nagas, 3 years old, and a couple of ancient camels were left, beside the caricature and various halt and lame, who looked as if they were dancing all the time because they had cut feet. However, we had become completely fatalistic. We proposed to take vast stores of water and put the rest of our trust in Allah. We also proposed to leave Kufara as soon as possible. Firstly, because our hosts were so prodigious in their hospitality that we could not bear to take advantage of it longer than was absolutely necessary for our work. Secondly, because, though what may be called the party directly responsible to the government were very kindly disposed toward the guests of their rulers, the ancient and old-fashioned Ekwan held aloof. They would not believe that any strangers could have been given permission to penetrate their guarded privacy. They were torn between their desire to do honor to the Sayyids and their horror of diverging a hair's breadth from immemorial custom. Among the Zuyas there were now 2 factions. Many had been infected by the stories of the Bazama family and Abdullah, but a small party had gradually formed in our favor under the leadership of Suleiman Bu Matar. There were always, however, currents and cross-currents under the surface which sometimes rippled into open suspicion. Also, there had been many very persistent inquiries on the part of the most lawless elements as to the exact date of our departure and our proposed route. It was known that the soldiers would not be traveling with us, so we should be an easy prey if the tribesmen wanted to play their last card. We therefore spread the rumor that we should remain at least a fortnight longer at Taj, and privately began to make preparations for another flight, this time aided and abetted by the Kaimakan, who planned to send our little caravan a day's march ahead while we were still openly in Taj. Under the guidance of a trusted sheikh, we could overtake it on fast-trotting camels. Meanwhile, it was necessary that we should investigate the western end of the oasis. For this purpose, Sheikh Suleiman offered himself as guide and host combined. "I will arrange everything," he said quietly. "Do not trouble yourselves. You shall travel in comfort." We rather wondered what represented his idea of comfort when he announced that we would start 2 hours before dawn, as it was a very long way. However, we duly rose at 9 o'clock by night, Arabic 3 a.m., and shortly afterwards a muffled thudding on the door warned us that our escort had arrived. We hurried out, clutching all available blankets, for it was extremely cold. The moon had set, so at first I thought 2 immense towers had sprung up in the night outside the house. A second glance revealed them as very tall Hijin. They were barracked with difficulty, and I mounted the most uncomfortable saddle I have ever met. It must have had the advantage, from the camel's point of view, of being exceedingly light, for it consisted merely of 2 bars about 10 inches apart, across which was doubled a carpet, with an upright spoke in front and behind, but it had every possible disadvantage for the aching bones of the rider. Little did I guess that I was destined, with a few short pauses, to spend no less than 17 hours upon that seat of torture. The commandant, Salah Effendi, with his gold and green cloak thrown across his thickest jird, and Hassanein mounted donkeys which looked microscopic from my towering height. The 2 soldiers perched themselves, one behind the other, on the second Hijin, and down into the wadi we swung, picking our way slowly till we came to the massed palms when the party settled down to ride. The silvery stone of the marsh was a frozen gray in the starlight, and the houses of Joff but a blur on a low ridge. The leaf hedges were rustling fingers stretched out to bar our way, and the great beams of the shaduks, wells, were ghostly gibbets in the shadow of the palms. Outside of one of Joff's blind walls we barracked, when, after prolonged knocking, a sleepy slave announced that Sheikh Suleiman was not yet ready. Arab life is very adaptable. Within a few minutes of receiving the news, the saddle carpets had been spread in the shelter of the wall, a fire of palm leaves, sent out by our host, lighted, dates produced from the same hospitable source, and we had all settled down for a prolonged wait under the still brilliant stars. I think I slept for a few moments, my head on a stone, for when I was aroused by a soft salam alaikum, the stars were less brilliant, and a third slender-limbed hejim was outlined against the gray sky. We set forth briskly to the south, and soon the long block of Joff's houses and the neatly fenced gardens of the Sayyids lay behind us. The donkeys kept up a sort of short amble, while the camels slipped into the tireless, swinging stride, half swift walk, half trot, the most comfortable pace in the world. As the light grew clearer, I saw that mine was a big Tibesti beast, palest gray, long-haired and stately, but not as finely bred as the other two. They were the fast Tuareg breed of piebald gray and white, with blue eyes, very thin, like greyhounds in their lean slenderness. They ought to be able to do the racing trot, which covers 10 kilometers an hour. Through the dawn we rode until the sun grew hot, always west with a hint of south. The large sweep of Joff palms disappeared on our right. Zurich was left on the other side. Then, as we came into the open space beyond, where the large mounds of Hatab begin, we saw that we were leaving the enchanted wadi behind us. We skirted the long strip of palms which forms Tolilib. There is no proper village in the oasis, but scattered through the green, one catches sight of a few houses of the slaves who tend the palms. As we went farther west, the mounds grew to hillocks, and the red sand was tufted here and there with high grass, while masses of gray bushes climbed over the miniature girds. 4 hours after sunrise, while yet Tolab was far ahead, Sheikh Suleiman called a halt. A cold north wind had arisen and was finding the old tender spot in my shoulder, so I was glad when he chose the largest sandhill for our picnic breakfast. Bright scarlet rugs were spread on the lee side for the men and a faded rose-red carpet in the shelter of a smaller mound for me, as a woman could not eat with the soldiers. I fancy it would have hurt the Zuia's susceptibilities if he had been obliged to encounter feminine fingers in the common bowl. After that meal, we had an idea of what the Bedouin means by traveling comfortably. A complete portable kitchen must have been hidden in the capacious, brightly striped gourds that hung on either side of the blue-eyed camel. The most delicious odors were soon wafted from a pot stewing on a brushwood fire. A soldier brought me a long-necked brass ewer and a towel before my breakfast was shyly handed me by an ancient and dignified servitor of the sheik, by name Mohammed, who had run beside the chief the whole way from Joff without protest, though he carried a heavy rifle. I had been given a brass tray of dates to eat, and I was contemplating writing a monograph on the various uses of the date in Kufara. It is used for all sweetening purposes in cooking. Mixed with some other local ingredient, it makes a sticky sort of glue. A soft date, slightly squashed, takes the place of a cork, and every tin of oil is sealed that way. The stones apparently make studs for the nostrils of Tibu girls. I feel sure there are other uses, but the appearance of food prevented my thinking of them that morning among the bristling mounds of Hatab. I lifted a plated cover of palm leaves embroidered in red, and there were nearly a dozen hard-boiled eggs surrounding a mound of crisp, flat bread. Another layer of palm leaf disclosed enough cold lamb, cooked in red pepper and onions, to feed all the party liberally, while the whole was balanced upon a bowl of delicious thick soup full of vermicelli, carrots, and other unknown vegetables. All was hot with scarlet strips of filfil. Greed and fear struggled in my mind, but the former won, and all the cold north wind could not cool my fevered tongue after I had partaken of that highly spiced dish. When a row of little tin teapots were heating on separate piles of ashes, I joined the party under the larger mound, and we drank hot sweet tea, which tasted strongly of the inside of the gerba which had been hidden underneath the saddlebags. Afterwards, there was half an hour's amiable silence, punctuated by rare remarks, chiefly concerning the flora and fauna of the wadi, this being the least suspicious subject of conversation we could think of, and Mohammed being visibly eager to distrust. It could not be lengthened out interminably because there are no wild animals in Kufara, and I never saw a bird, though I was told that several species, chief among them the wagtail-like Abu Fasada, make their appearance in March at the harvest time. The grain is a winter crop. Of insects there is a large variety, chiefly distinguished by their voracious appetites. Cleopatra's asp, a small fawn-colored snake, lurks among the sand, and in the oasis there are several kinds of serpents, large and small, most of them poisonous. We were assured that one large dark snake measures at least 6 feet and is particularly feared by the natives. Perhaps this is the legendary beast of Hawaish. After our excellent meal, Tolab appeared much nearer and the wind much less strong. We rode on for another couple of hours and verified our suspicions that the wadi had no definite end. We had a bitter argument as to degrees, for we had not dared to bring even a compass, which for once was later decided in my favor by the setting sun. Then we turned to the scattered gardens of Tolab, where I saw roses, verbena, and tiny lemon trees, all neatly tied up in fiber matting after the fashion of English gardeners. There is absolutely nothing to see in this last oasis of Kufara, whose sand brick houses are scattered round the cultivated plots without regular order. We noticed a number of shaduks worked by small gray donkeys, and were hurried away by our host to get a glimpse of the far distant Gebel Neri, as he had become quite interested in our exploration. These mountains are wonderful landmarks for at least 2 days south and north, but when we passed them on the way from Busima, we had no means of judging their height. We thought they might rise 150 to 200 meters above the surrounding country, which would make them 750 to 800 above sea level, but this was only a guess. 2.5 days' journey northwest of Tolab lies Ribiana, behind a Gara twice as big as that of Busima. We were told that the population consists of about 100 Zuiyas and Tibus. There is an old Zawiya founded by the 4 original Ekwans sent by Sidi Ben Ali. The sheikh is Abu Bakr. There is a salt marsh between the mountain and the strip of palms some 18 kilometers long, at the southern end of which is the Zawiya, while at the northern end is a village of about 10 houses. This information we gathered from Sheikh Suleiman as we rode round the western end of Tolab and turned homewards through the waste of Low Hatab toward Tolilib. Thereafter the hours seemed interminable. Nothing ever got any nearer, while the saddlebars felt like knife blades. The only break was when we dismounted for the Asr prayers. Eventually, we entered the northern edge of Tolilib's palms, and were only too thankful when, just before sunset, the tireless Zuiya called a halt beside an immense sandbank, and the morning meal was repeated. "We will take a glass of tea to refresh us," said our host modestly. But very soon another savory mess was being stewed in the capacious pot, while Salah Effendi produced fresh mint leaves which had been given to him at Tolab. This time everyone ate swiftly, plunging great chunks of bread into the basin of stewed vegetables and meat. But once again I was provided with a separate meal, tastefully arranged on wicker plates. In half an hour we were in the saddle again, but the animals were tired, and the sunset blazed behind us before we drew near the dark shadow of Zurich. A 3/4 moon mingled her silver light with the red of the flaming west, and the amber sands reflected the most extraordinary colors, which changed in the unreal light like the transformation scene in the pantomime. The pace was just too quick to walk in the soft, deep sand, so I had to cling to my painful saddle for another 3 hours. In starlight, we had left Joff. In starlight, we returned to it, steering by a glazing fire set to guide us to the gardens of Sayed Rida, from where Mahmud el-Jadawi had asked us to bring some sacks of dates, probably for our own journey. The scene of the early morning was repeated, for the Sayed's black slaves, fantastic figures in tattered sacking or shreds of cotton, brought bundles of palm leaves for a fire and poured a great pile of hard golden dates onto a huge woven platter. We crunched these as we rested our aching bones on hastily spread carpets, while more and more ebony figures joined the group, and just the heads of the camels, solemnly chewing the cud, came into the circle of wavering firelight under the stars. The last hour's ride was very slow, for the Hijin were unaccustomed to carrying loads, but it was done to the accompaniment of marriage music from the town and wild ulala'in of women, mixed with firing of guns and beating of drums. "He is taking a very little girl. She is only 13, said Salih Effendi of the bridegroom. I thought of the woman-child and her stiff, heavy draperies, clinging shyly and desperately to the veil which she would so soon have to raise for an unknown man, the stranger to whom her parents had given her. Yusuf and Mohammed were waiting for us at the top of the cliff, two unrecognizable figures entirely muffled in immense woolen jerds. With the usual Arab cheerfulness, they had come to the conclusion that we had already been murdered by the Zuyas. The attitude of the two men had been very characteristic during our stay at Taj. Both knew by this time that the object of the expedition was to write a book about the country. Both believed it must be for the good of the Senussi, since we traveled under the Sayed's protection. But after this they differed. Yusuf felt that he had accomplished his duty when we arrived safely in Kufara. He was delighted that we were well received and hospitably entertained by the government, for he thought that we should be impressed by the generosity of the Sayeds. Mohammed felt instinctively that we did not need impressing, and all he wanted was that the work of Sidi Idris should be successfully achieved. Both were conscious of the undercurrent of unrest. Yusuf, treating us as strangers and himself as one of the people of Kufara, explained to us with perfect justice that the position was largely due to our own mistakes. Often we had trusted the wrong people. Often I, alas, had forgotten the nice shades of Moslem feminine behavior in my thirst for knowledge. Muhammad swept aside all these points. He counted that Sidi Idris and he and we were all pitted for the moment against those who hampered, consciously or unconsciously, the work of the Sayed. Therefore, he used to encourage us in friendly fashion, gather news for us, explain exactly how we should treat such and such a rumor, and urge us to persevere. Yusuf always labored to vindicate the honor of the Sayeds. Mohammed, knowing that no vindication was necessary, labored to accomplish through us the task he had been given so many weeks before in Jedabiyah. The one thought in terms of couscous and padded camel saddles, the other in something he vaguely termed work, but which, of course, should logically have been the pencils and notebooks he distrusted. The day after our long expedition to Tolab was El Gumma, so luckily breakfast, a mighty bowl of pigeons, eggs, and carrots, was sent to our house, and we stayed indoors till it was time for the noon prayers, announced by the muezzin and by a runner who knocked at the outer door of each house with his cry of invitation ever repeated. Hassanein clothed himself in the cleanest jerd and departed to the Zawiya with the devout Muhammad. I slipped into an outer room beyond the mosque, for there was no place in the latter for women, and watched the impressive scene discreetly hidden behind a pillar. All the Ekwan were present in their most resplendent silk jubbas, with snowy veils above their many-colored kufias. They made splashes of vivid red, orange, and green among the coarse white jerds of the Bedouins. After the last azan, with sound of fife and drum, Escorted by a guard of soldier slaves in their gala attire, khaki with sundry embroideries, the Kaimakam arrived in state with Sidi Moy el-Din and Sidi Ibrahim, the sons of Sayyid Ahmad Sharif, and Sidi Sanusi, son of Sidi al-Abid. His usual grave dignity was accentuated as he mounted the mimbar, a massive figure in striped robes and purple silk, with embroidered blue jacket underneath a gorgeous many-tasseled kufiya, stiff with gold thread, over his spotless white turban, from which depended the finest silk and wool veil. In delivering the usual Friday speech, he asked the prayers and benediction of Allah for the 4 earliest caliphs, Abu Bakr, Omar, Othman, and Ali, and for 12 other sainted followers and friends of the Prophet. After the prayer, a solemn procession, headed by the sons of the Sanusi Sayyids, passed in ponderous silence, save for the rustling of bare feet on palm mats, to the dim inner chamber to salute the Quba of the Mahdi. If it be possible for Taj to be more dignified and impressive than usual, it achieves that effect on Al-Gumma, for all day one catches glimpses between the dark walls of the richly garbed equine moving slowly, silk jerds carefully raised above the sand. After the Asr prayers, the deputation of 4 who had received us, the judge, Sidi Salah, Sidi Ahmad Sanusi, and Sidi Omar, came to bid us the city's formal farewell, though we were not expected really to leave for several days. The visit was meant tactfully to imply that we were now free of official receptions and banquets, though Arab hospitality could only be satisfied by privately sending large meals to our house while we remained in Taj. We lured the judge and the portly dignitaries into our sunlit court, but they were terrified at being photographed. We had to treat them like children at the dentist's and keep up a flow of laughing conversation about the painlessness of the operation while they huddled pathetically together for comfort and support. Later in the day, we were visited by Hassan and Hussein Bazama from Ribiana, relations of the men who had spread so many false reports about us. They doubtless came to Taj in the first place to discover how much of their kinsman's tale was true. Finding us the guests of Sidi Idris, they decided the larger part must be incorrect. Hassan was dark and lean and altogether too reminiscent of Abdullah to please me, but his brother was a nice little plump person, kindly disposed toward the world in general, and most unusually truthful for a Bedouin, for when his elder brother tried to sell us a camel, he remarked in a small, plaintive voice, "He is a very old camel." By this time we had learned how to make Arab tea. It must have been a good brew that day, for the brothers verified all Sheikh Suleiman's information about Ribiana and urgently invited us to visit it. We politely refused, having seen quite enough of these lonely strips of palms with a few deserted dark red houses. They seemed slightly hurt, so we explained that our camels really could not be expected to do an extra week's traveling before the long Jagabub trip. As a matter of fact, we were very much troubled about our caravan. 5 of the Nagas had foaled and could not be taken away from their offspring. We had given the soldiers 6 camels for their homeward journey via Zigan and Jallo, and they complained bitterly about the inadequacy of the number. Maraja had married the pale, dark-eyed woman who had traveled with us from Busima, and he wanted to take his wife back to Jedabiyah with him. Abdul Rahim very naturally refused, as already they had insufficient transport. The sergeant was furious and threatened to stay behind, but we were no longer interested in their troubles, having quite enough of our own. The girbas we bought in the souk were too new to be safe, and we were desperately afraid of losing our water. Suleiman, the guide, suddenly announced that only the Asyad ever went to Jagabub, and that, as nobody had traveled that way for more than 3 years, the one well at Zakar would not only be filled up, but probably covered by a dune. As the water was very far away, it might take 3 days to dig down to it. Worst of all, we had only 7 camels. 4 of these must carry water and 2 fodder. That left only 1 for food for 6 persons, their luggage, and their tents. We tried to hire Tibu camels at an exorbitant price, but found that nobody would let their beasts go north in midwinter, for the camels have very thin coats in Kufara and generally die when they reach a colder climate. I explained that there had been no difference in the temperature of Aujela and Taj, but was told that the Jagabug route would be bitterly cold and the winds almost intolerable. With this pleasant thought in mind, we suggested buying a couple of camels, but there was none to be sold except the ancient Bazama beast, already shivering. "He will die on the way," said Yusuf, hating to make a bad bargain. "I don't mind if he does, providing he will last 4 or 5 days beyond the Zakar well. We shall have drunk his load by then, and shall not need him any more," I said. "Do you think he will break down before then?" Yusuf would not commit himself. One could see it in his eye if he meant to die in 2 days, was all he vouchsafed. Our friend Mahmud el-Jadawi bestirred himself energetically on our account, and after searching most of Jaf, he triumphantly produced the most amazing camel I have ever seen. It looked as if a portion of it had been left out in the making. We all walked around it in mystified silence to discover what was missing. It had the self-satisfied expression of a short, plump, curry-loving Indian colonel, and almost certainly there was something odd about its shape. I looked at Yusuf appealingly. "It is very woolly." "Yes, it has much wool," he said with polite despair. We decided not to purchase it, and were rewarded at the last moment by the production by a Tibu of a really magnificent camel, half Asian and half beast of burden. Its price was very high, 200 medjidies, but we did not even wait to bargain. It was too necessary to us. We hated letting it go out of our sight for a moment, but its master insisted that we could not have it till the following day, and we were obliged to let the caravan start without it. This time the flight was well arranged, though it was precipitated by another of Abdullah's darts. We learned that he had been spreading far and wide a story that the venerated Sidi Ahmed el-Rifi, teacher and advisor of the Mahdi, had prophesied disaster to any stranger who traveled on the Jagabug route. "It is a sacred road between our 2 holy places," he had said. "It is for the Sayyids and their followers only. Nobody else may go safely by it." Whether the saying had other origin than the twisted brain of Abdullah, we did not know, but it might have a distressing effect on the easily roused fanaticism of the retinue. We therefore hurried the small caravan off early one morning with the nominal destination of Hawari, because there was a certain amount of grazing in the neighborhood, and it would be natural for the camels to rest there for a week or 10 days before starting for Jagabug. As a matter of fact, they skirted the village and main oases and camped in an isolated palm grove some miles farther on, where their presence was little likely to be suspected. Next day we made obvious preparations for a tour of the wadi, and then, just after sunset, while all the devout inhabitants of Taj were occupied with their prayers, we slipped out of our discreet little door, wandered carelessly around a projecting wall, and found 2 camels ready saddled in charge of a plaintive Yusuf, who hated the idea of traveling in a strong north wind, bitterly cold. Muffled in coarse jerds, only our new primrose leather boots with crimson uppers laced with scarlet thongs apparent to the public gaze, we plodded out of the little town, followed by Yusuf, Suleiman, and a fortnight-old foal. The wind was so strong that we hardly cast a backward glance at the oasis which had shown us so much in so short a time. It was a complete chapter of life we left behind. We felt that we had studied its pages thoroughly, but we knew that we had not read all that lay between the lines. Through a glass, darkly, we had been allowed a glimpse of an unsuspected civilization aloof from our own and utterly different. For a few days we had moved amidst the friendship and enmity of a rigidly isolated religious fraternity, feeling something of their remote fanaticism, much of their warm generosity, a little of the almost pathetic simplicity which underlay their plots and counterplots. Yet we were ever strangers in a strange land, welcome to their dignified hospitality, but never admitted for a minute to the inner workings of their minds. Some glimpses we caught behind the scenes. Some threads to unravel the unspoken mysteries were put into our hands later by a suddenly talkative Yusuf. But the secrets of Taj are still safe with us. Each one must unravel them for himself, for no traveler may tell when he has once crossed the threshold not only the great house on the cliff, but of the life of these people where each man's brain is an island in itself, whose secrets are as jealously guarded as the oasis is by nature. The desert had paid us her debt. We had conquered her waterless desolation and her perilous dunes. We had won the right to her secret, and generously she showed it. Yet we knew she grudged us our triumph. As the dark stone houses disappeared swiftly into the red sand and black rocks, so that, looking back after a few minutes, one might believe one had dreamed of the wadi and its people, I wondered what price we should pay for our knowledge. Behind the first ledge of rocks, a gnome-like figure, green-hooded and cloaked, rose suddenly beside a microscopic gray donkey, while another, unrecognizably disguised by a scarlet handkerchief which left but an eye visible, appeared with a most unwilling sheep. They were the Commandant, Salih Effendi, sent to accompany us to our first camp, and a soldier to slaughter the sheep in our honor. Subdued greetings were hardly finished when a portly, panting figure, white jerd blowing wildly over a dark blue jubba, turban and spectacles slightly awry, hurried over the rocks. It was Sayyid Ahmed Sanusi, come to give us a last blessing, with many injunctions to the guide to look after us well. After the Fatha had been gravely repeated, he clutched Yusuf's sleeve and murmured mysteriously, "Will you not halt your caravan round the next gird, as I wish to send out to you food for your journey, meat, bread, and rice?" In a still lower voice, he explained that many of the friendly Ikhwan had wished to feast us, but had been afraid of hurting the feelings of the Kaimakan, who looked upon us as his guests. Arab custom ordains that when a stranger comes to a town, any man who visits him afterward sends food to him or feasts him in his house. Therefore, the Ikhwan had been in some difficulty. Either they broke their laws of hospitality, or they ran counter to the generous wishes of the Kaimakan, or they failed in respect to the Sayyid by not visiting the guests in his house. We remembered that the sons of Sayyid Ahmad Sharif and Sayyid El-Abd, boys between 14 and 17, had often waited to greet us as we left the house of Sidi Salah. We wanted to see if the Sit Khadijah wears the same clothes as our ladies, one had said shyly. But they were frightened of being photographed, the idea being that if one possesses a picture of a person, one possesses also his soul, or at least a certain hypnotic power over him. We were obliged regretfully to decline this delightful offer of Sidi Ahmed, as speed was necessary. Therefore, we hurried north as fast as our odd little procession, camels, donkeys, sheep, and foal, would go. The wind dropped after the first 3 hours, and a feeble moon rose in a clear, translucent sky. It was a night of color so marvelous that it was unreal. I knew the strange tricks moonlight could play in the desert, but only once before had I seen such startling effects, and that was in Chichen Chau. White moonlight on white sand makes an iridescent silvery sea, cold, almost cruel in its pale intangibility. But this was a golden light on an amber-red world, and, except that one could not see so far, it was as clear as the day. The palm trees were shades of sapphire, silvered at the edge, and their shadows hot, clear-cut purple. We rode through a world so wonderful that when we had skirted the dreaming village of Hawari and completely lost our way in the oasis beyond — the infallibility of guides is a very brittle myth in Libya — we hardly minded, but with jerds flung back, we reveled in unutterable stillness and color inconceivable. Even after we had turned to complete circles, and with a waning moon, unexpectedly discovered our camp discreetly hidden in a hollow between great clumps of palms and what looked like mimosa trees, we could not go into the tent, though it was one of the coldest nights we had. We sat outside amidst the violet and amber, and in spite of dates and cinnamon bread, wondered how soon we should wake up. Our desire for a swift and secret departure from the palm grove near Hawari was frustrated by the non-arrival of our new camel till the afternoon of the following day. By this time, of course, most of the population of the neighboring village of Awardel was in our camp. The Zuias were most friendly and terribly curious. Their shrewd, suspicious eyes and pale, mean faces encircled my tent all day, hoping to catch a glimpse to satisfy their curiosity. But out of sheer perversity, I smothered my face in the barakan and then snapshotted them when they were not looking. Unfortunately, I had left behind something of a reputation as a doctor, nature presumably having taken my patients in hand after my departure. So all day long my tent was thronged by women with the most mysterious maladies. The poorer ones crouched outside, their scarlet woolen barakans an effective contrast to their black tobes, the most picturesque combination I had yet seen. The wives of important sheiks were ushered into my tent, and the flaps closed after them by jealous male relatives. If they were young, they would not uncover their faces even to me, but mute, huddled bundles of voluminous draperies, with at least 3 barakans of rich dark weaving one over the other, they sat on my camp bed, while an ancient crony translated their needs. They wanted me to feel skin diseases through layers of garments, prescribe for invisible eyes, and generally guess at their ailments from the descriptions of their elderly relatives, who urged them at intervals, entirely without effect, not to be afraid. Their jewelry interested me, for they wore bracelets like gauntlets of thin beaten silver, reaching halfway from wrist to elbow, and odd flat rings, big and thin, as a 5-shilling piece. The day ended with a violent quarrel between Muhammad and Abdullah, who was to return with the soldiers to Jedabiyah, because the Kaimakan thought Sidi Idris was punish him more severely than he had power to do. The guide had told Muhammad he would beat his nose flat, apparently an appalling insult, for the uproar was prodigious, and in the middle of it, while everyone was shouting at the top of their voices, our trusted retainer wept like an infant. He was only comforted by permission to buy a slave girl he coveted. She had walked all the way from Darfur, he said, so she can walk to Jagabug with us. But we persuaded him to send her to Jalo later on. Their caravan was already overloaded without the ebony maiden's food and water, though we were horribly tempted to take her when we heard she was a good cook. As camel men were scarce at the moment in Kufara and fetched very high prices, we had taken Muhammad's follower, Ammar, instead. He was a plucky and willing boy, a pupil from the Jagabug Zawiya, but alas, no cook. The way he ruined our treasured rice was little short of a tragedy. The evening of January 24th was spent in a pursuit that was becoming habitual, that of sorting our rapidly diminishing baggage to see what could be left behind. This time the tent and the camp beds had to go. There would be no time to put up the tent on the Jagabub route. With our small and somewhat feeble retinue, after walking 12 hours a day, probably against a strong wind, by the time the camels were attended to and the rice or flour cooked, one would have no energy left to struggle with tent pegs. The most one could hope for would be a flea bag on the ground sheet in the inadequate shelter of a zareba made of our food and fodder sacks. We now had 1 suitcase, a sack of provisions, and 2 rolls of bedding. "We might put the ground sheets in the bedding," I said casually, looking around the pathetically small pile of our belongings, to see if we could possibly do without anything else. "Your flea bag is the thinnest. We had better put it in between the flaps." I thought there was a certain nervousness in Hassanine's eyes as we undid the bulky roll, but I did not quite understand it, even when a bottle of ambered eau de cologne and an immense attaché case fell out, scattering a complete manicure set in the sand. I was quite used to this sort of thing by now, but I was mildly surprised when a violent protest followed my efforts to insert the waterproof sheet. Take care, you will hurt yourself." "What on earth do you mean? Woolen flea bags don't bite." The thought struck us both instantaneously that this was hardly correct at the moment, and we were both laughing, when suddenly a pain that could hardly have been inflicted by even the largest Libyan bug shot through my hand. "What is that?" I gasped, and pulled out a very large, sharp saw. For one horrible moment, I thought my companion had developed tendencies to homicidal mania as I stood open-mouthed with the tool in my hand. "I've hidden that damn thing in my bedding for 3 months, and whenever I turned over it ran in my shoulder, and I've cut myself on it 3 times, he said viciously. "But why, I could only stutter. "I thought it would be so useful," was the reply. Visions of the treeless desert with no tuft of moss or blade of grass must have crossed both our minds simultaneously, for almost before I could ask feebly, "What did you mean to cut?" he said, "I don't know, I just felt it would come in useful, to make things with," he added hastily under my baleful eye. "But I didn't want you to see it. I knew you would laugh." "Laugh!" I exclaimed scornfully, sucking my fingertips. "After all, you needn't make such a fuss. It's no worse than your bread." And I remembered the days on the way to Tyzerbö when I had insisted on treasuring a piece of 10-day-old bread in my knapsack with much the same sort of feeling that it might come in useful. My companion, unlawfully in search of matches, the only things we refused to share were matches and soap, though we never used the latter, cut his hand badly on the rough, sharp edge of my precious loaf, and thereafter spoke of food as the most dangerous element in the desert. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Secret of the Sahara, Kufara by Rosita Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Through the Mountains. Loading the camels on January 25th was something of a difficulty. The whole male population of Hawaii came out to help, or to hinder, while various shrouded female forms lurked in the shadows of palm clumps, hoping to exchange a few eggs for green tea. But we had left our last stores at Kufara, so could do no bartering. A young merchant from Wadai offered us crimson-dyed leather at 3.5 medjidies for a whole goatskin. He would easily make his fortune among London boot shops. That morning was another revelation of Zuia character, for if we left anything out of sight for a minute, it disappeared. I lost my pet woolly scarf, which I used to roll around underneath my thin cotton garments, my only protection against the north winds. Mohammed politely spread his rug for 2 venerable equan to sit upon. A few moments later they and it vanished together. Yusuf's bright-colored blanket followed suit, with Hassanine's sleeping helmet. It is not to be wondered at, therefore, that our farewells were somewhat chilly. Amar was venomous because some thrifty housewife had appropriated the grid on which he made his almost uneatable bread. We shuddered to think what it would be like without it. By 8 a.m., we had received the last mixed blessings and warnings. The chorus of marhabas and masalamas had died among the palms, and an amazing sense of peace had descended upon us. For the first time in 3 months, we were a completely friendly party, united to achieve a common object by dint of hard work and endurance. It was a wonderful feeling. Everybody was happy and nobody shirked. Even the plump Yusuf forgot his plaintive whine, and with a fat smile gathered hatab and urged on the camels. Unfortunately, our great gray Tibu beast was suffering badly from his first heavy date meal, just as the rest of the caravan had done at Butterfall a month previously. At the last moment, however, Sidi Mohammed el-Jadawi, seeing that the necessary dates for fodder took up 3 complete loads, lent us one of Sayed Rita's foaling nagas. We had no baggage saddle, Hawiya, for her, so we doubled across her back our thin, single-fly tent, which we had meant to leave behind. At the last moment, Yusuf, ever economical, stuck the 3 light poles in somewhere. We therefore started with a caravan of 9, but they were distinctly overloaded, for we had to carry water for 6 or 7 days, since Suleiman the guide was uncertain as to how long it would take to dig out the Zakar well. That day we marched 10 hours, with a hot sun and a cold north-northwest wind. We left the Hawari Gara, a dark block to the west, with the great indigo cliffs of the Gebel Neri far beyond it. Gradually we drew away from the hot red sands of Kufara with their patches of strange black stones. In the afternoon we emerged onto the pale, flattish country sweeping up to the foot of the Hawash Mountains. These, however, were still invisible when we camped at sunset, because the 2 smallest camels refused to go any farther. We missed the blacks while struggling to unload our unruly beasts, 2 of whom were 3-year-olds and never could be barracked without a prolonged fight. We built our zaribas with their backs to the persistent north wind, but nature played us a trick, for the temperature descended unpleasantly. We sat comfortably inside our flea bags, however, cooking rice and coffee and watching a fading moon slowly dim our solitary candle. Next morning Mohammed roused us long before the dawn, and we were away by 7 a.m., but we were very understaffed, for Ammar and the old Suleiman were both too feeble to lift the immense fodder loads, and Hassanein and I were exceedingly inefficient. Nevertheless, complete cheerfulness still reigned. The Bedouins invented and sang lusty doggerel rhymes of personal tendencies, such as, "If Sidi Yusuf won't walk today, a new little wife won't come his way." We saw the Hawash Mountains, a long line of round peaks on the horizon, about 8 a.m., and at the same moment discovered that our new guide had deficient sight. He was a little, old, weazened Bedouin, very poor, but very shrewd for all his apparent simplicity. He was clad only in worn sandals, an ancient leather skullcap, and a pathetically tattered gray jerd. He was quite illiterate, and his rare speech was in a dialect which even Mohammed found some difficulty in following. He shuffled along all day, bent over his palm stick, untiring and unresponsive, though occasionally his cracked, hoarse voice joined in the lilting refrains of the retinue. Only when he failed to pick out a certain hill with a cleft top did he tell us that he had once rashly interfered in a private battle between 2 black soldiers and received a blow on the head which had permanently damaged his eyesight. After this admission, I think we all expected to lose the way, but one becomes terribly fatalistic in the desert. Allah alone knows is repeated with complete simplicity by every traveler in the great wilderness. By this time I could well understand the carelessness of the Bedouins, their lack of forethought, and their childlike trust in Providence. After all, what does it really matter on a 12 days waterless route whether one overloads one's camel with a couple of extra gerbas and a spare jar of fodder in order to ensure a day or 2 more of life? A few strong iblis may dry up all the water. It may go bad, or the skins may leak, or a load may be thrown onto sharp stones so that the gerbas burst. On the other hand, the guide may lose his memory or his instinct. Day after day, without a landmark, with the ever-present knowledge that one slight mistake means destruction, is surely enough to trouble the most experienced. One day's bad march, owing to a mere trifle such as irregularly balanced loads, sore backs, or unaccustomed date feeding, will endanger the whole issue, for the Zakar, Jagabub, or the Zakar-Siwa routes are the longest known stretches without water. The Boima-Farafa route is 12 days without water. The camels arrive completely exhausted, and if an extra day be added to the march, they probably do not arrive at all. The men may get sore feet or fever, but they cannot ride the heavily burdened beasts. The terrible north wind may blow day and night, making every step laborious, yet the daily average has got to be kept up. Therefore, the Bedouins smile when one makes a pitiful little attempt to arm oneself against nature, to forestall or prevent her rigors. If Allah wills, we shall arrive, they say gravely, and turn the conversation to lighter matter. Fired by the example of Mohammed and Miraja, Yusuf began to wonder whether a wife or 2 would not satisfy his affectionate heart more than a camel.
A woman is so much cheaper, he sighed, and told us that among the Ekwan no dowry is paid to the bride's father. A small gift of silk or gold is given to the mother and sisters, perhaps a necklace or bracelet to the girl herself, and there the expense ends. 25 medjidies are enough, said Yusuf. But if one wants to take the daughter of a Bedouin sheikh, one must pay many camels. How many? I asked. Oh, 10, 20, 50, and one must give the girl silk and cloth for her clothes besides. He dropped into meditative silence. One by one, we saw the landmarks of the Zigan track to the west, and learned that the northwesterly course we were following had been the original Zigan route till one Mohammed Sharif established the present, more direct way. First we saw the Guardia, a square block of dark cliff, then the Geret-esh-Sharif, called after a traveler who shortened by a day the Kufara-Jallo journey, and late in the afternoon a conical hill called the Kaima, tent, by the Mojavras, and the Mogan, funnel, by the Zuiyas. One great advantage we had over our previous journey. This time the sun was behind us all the time. The difference was enormous. Riding or walking for 12 hours, day after day, straight into a blazing sun, without hat brim or umbrella, had been very trying to one's eyes and head. Altogether, the absence of glare, the feeling that the larger part of our work was done, with no necessity to placate a constantly irritated retinue, or to weld together the most inharmonious human elements, caused us to regard the dreary kilometers that lay before us as the most peaceful part of our journey. I want to see the white sands again, I said, and urged my little expedition on into the rose-purple hills. The Hawash are not really mountains. They are an irregular mass of round, rocky hills, cliffs and cones, and their direction would baffle even an experienced geographer. We spent any spare moments at dawn and at sunset sitting on the top of some abrupt hillock with binoculars, compass, and a notebook, studying the complicated positions of the local mountains, but hair grew gray and temper short in the task. Always there was a new wall of hills in the distance, generally running at an unexpected angle, and when we asked the retinue for explanations, all they could say was, "Allah alone knows." I wanted to camp within the first line of the Hawash, for by now I was just as anxious to leave the mysterious enchanted land as I had been to enter it. The circling horizon of strange hills seemed to shut us in with the hot-colored sands, but the cool white dunes beyond called us back to the open deserts of the north. Just as Suleiman wavered as to whether we should turn right or left of a large cliff, sudden news brought by Yusuf and Ammar, who had climbed a gird we had just left, abruptly shattered our peace. Our fat retainer was actually running, a swift, uneven little trot, which made him pant as he shouted, "There is a caravan behind us!" The idea was startling, to say the least, for no one had traveled by this route for nearly 4 years, and we knew that nobody was prepared to start when we left Kufara. At first we told Yusuf that he had dreamed his caravan. We were 2 days' march from Hawari, from where all travelers start, and when we left the oasis there had been no question of anybody else going north by any route. Ammar, however, was equally positive. "We looked through the glasses," he said. "There are 4 or 6 camels and nearly a dozen men with them, and they are traveling fast, about 3 hours behind us." This was so definite that we had to believe it, and Mohammed dotted the I's. "We shall be attacked tonight. It is a habit of the Zuiyas. They wait till a caravan is outside their country so that they cannot be blamed, and then they eat it up." "It is not the Zuiyas," indignantly refuted the guide. "They have great respect for the Sayyids. It is the Tibus. They have swift camels. They attack in the mountains where no travelers ever go, and then they fly south to the French country before anything is discovered." Intense gloom descended on the little party. Sunset light was fading, and the one break in the purple stones ahead was a patch of vivid sand dotted with 5 camel skeletons. We had only 3 rifles and our revolvers. Discretion in this case was certainly the better part of valor, so we decided on ignominious flight. We left the neighborhood of the wide pass leading to Zakar and, in darkness, felt our way west through curling defiles and over steep ridges, always driving the camels across the stony patches to avoid leaving footprints in the sand. When Suleiman thought we had gone far enough from our course to baffle any pursuers, we barracked in a convenient hollow out of sight of anyone who was not standing on the hills immediately surrounding us. "No fires," said Mohammed sternly. "No light at all. And we will put the camels a little way in front of us. They will move if anyone comes." "What shall we eat?" moaned Yusuf plaintively. "We must have a fire to cook." I agreed, thinking I should be much braver after some hot coffee, for it was very cold that night. But Mohammed was adamantine. He hung his revolver around Suleiman's neck with strict injunctions to the guide to shoot straight and may Allah direct the bullet. He then suggested making a fortified zariba on the hillside. Yusuf and I, after furtive glances at the enormous loads, with a very long march fresh in our minds, thought it would be much better to perish comfortably in the hollow. "It will only prolong the fight if we defend the hill," I said plaintively. "I want to go to sleep on that nice soft patch of sand." But, unfortunately, Hasanain and Ammar were also against me. Therefore, we were forced to drag the large fodder sacks laboriously up the first ridge of the hill and push them into a serried wall on a ledge. I have never been crosser in my whole life, but it was a beautiful little fort when it was finished. I felt that only a very energetic bullet would get through those immense date sacks, and the position would certainly be impregnable as long as any of the defenders were alive. The gurbas were arranged in front of us, protected by stones, so, sure of food and water, we could even stand a siege. The camels were below us in the hollow. Yusuf and I again suggested a very tiny fire, but Mohammed refused, and we contented ourselves with a 4-day-old bread and tinned corned beef. After that, I silently unrolled my flea bag, preparatory to placing my revolvers, the aneroid, and the thermometer beside my pillow. "I shall not go to bed," said Hasanain sternly. "We must take turns to watch." "The right is with you," replied Mohammed with alacrity. "Is your rifle loaded, Ammar, my son? We will all watch." This, however, was too much. Yusuf and I merely ignored the remark, but as I gave a last comforting wiggle to feel the thick woolly end of my flea bag with my toes, I heard Hasanain's voice somewhere above me, alert and strained. "If anyone comes into sight, shall I speak to them first or fire at once? What is your custom here?" Two simultaneous answers blended with my sleep. "Speak first," came drowsily from Yusuf. "Shoot quickly and shoot straight," from Mohammed, "or you will never speak again." The only thing that disturbed my slumbers that night was a little yellow sand mouse. I woke up feeling something fluffy on my cheek, and the absurd little beast was sitting on my nose. He scuttled to the other side of the zariba when I moved, and Ammar, bloodthirsty after a long, useless vigil, promptly killed and ate him. No Tibu warriors broke our peace, but unfortunately the fear of them made Mohammed wake me while the golden moon was still high and brilliant. I would not move without breakfast, so we hurriedly cooked rice and sweet tea in the unreal light almost as clear as noon, and laboriously pulled to pieces our beautiful zariba of the night before. We rolled the heavy date sacks down the hill because the men were too tired after their hard 24 hours to carry them. One burst and scattered dates right and left. Thrift and fear mingled in the minds of the retinue, but caution for the long road before us was uppermost in my mind. We picked them up in silence and dumped the load onto the protesting camels with almost personal dislike. Then we took to the trail again and, still in the moonlight, began picking our devious way around the irregular hills. When Suleiman finally led us back to the main pass, we thought any pursuing caravan must be far ahead, for it was 2 hours after sunrise. By this time, we were all inclined to think that the 4 or 6 camels and the dozen men existed only in the imagination of Yusuf and Ammar, but we had hardly turned into the wide sweep of sand that led north to the open spaces beyond the first range of Hawash when we came upon fresh camels' tracks ahead of us. The plump one was delighted. I was right, he exclaimed. And now we are safe, for when they do not catch us, they will think we have been warned and gone to Zigan to avoid them." Perhaps his surmise was correct. We never knew. We found no more traces of the mysterious caravan. Its origin and destination remained a secret. It had traveled 2 days and a half on the route to Zakar, far beyond the point where, long ago, travelers turned west to Zigan. Then it vanished as completely as a mirage, but mirage does not leave footprints in camel dung. In spite of the sleepless night, the Bedouins marched well that day. "If we reach those mountains tonight," had said Suleiman at 11 a.m., when we saw the second range of Hawash, blue and mauve, beyond a wide expanse of pale sand waves and low dunes, "we shall say our Asr prayers tomorrow at Zakar." So we plodded on cheerfully. It was cool and cloudy, with the usual north wind and an incessant mirage that made pools and lakes in every hollow. The old camel I had ridden when I left Jedabiyah seemed to know the way. He made a beeline for a certain cleft in the hills. Yusuf noticed this also, and asked if I knew the story of the sandgrouse and the camel. "They were arguing one day as to which was the cleverer," said the plump one, smiling. "I lay my eggs at random in the trackless desert," urged the sandgrouse, "and then I fly far and wide in search for food, but I can always come straight back to hatch them." The camel sniffed scornfully. "If I drink at a well as a tiny foal trotting beside my mother, though I never see it again, I can find my way back to it even when I am very old and blind." No, he is cleverer than that," interrupted Mohammed. "If a Naga has tasted the water of a well when she is in foal, the camel she gives birth to can return to it, surely." "Let us hope this particular camel has drunk of the well at Jagabub," I suggested. "Inshallah," replied Yusuf devoutly. We found a delightfully sheltered spot between 2 hills that night, so did not trouble to build a zareba. The thermometer registered a frost, but I think it had been affected by the mental atmosphere of the previous night, because we did not feel very cold. I remember I drank so much coffee that I could not sleep, so I did not mind when the Bedouins insisted on making a fire 3 hours before dawn and cooking their asida, a sticky mass of damp flour flavored with onions and zait, or oil. We must have been particularly inexpert with the loading, for in spite of this early breakfast, we started only just before sunrise. The new gray camel lay down almost at once, for he had not recovered from his greed. We had to divide his girbas among the others, for water is needed to harden the sand when digging the Zakar well. We watched the caravan anxiously as, leaving the second mass of the Hawash hills, it crossed a rolling expanse of great flat slabs of stone, broken and slippery. However, it toiled slowly but safely across them, and about 10 a.m. we were moving in sparkling white sand, blinding dazzlingly clean in the hot sun. There was practically no wind for once, and Yusuf actually discarded his overcoat after he had climbed a mound to point out a square, solid black gara among surrounding stony girds. "Near that is the well," he announced. "We shall be there in 1 hour or perhaps 4. As a matter of fact, we saw the 2 tufts of palm scrub that marked the Zakar well at noon, and they looked scarcely a stone's throw away among the sands white as snow. But we only reached them 2 hours later. That last caravan that passed must have suffered severely en route, for there were bits of broken baggage among scattered camel skeletons. Yusuf wished to ignore several legs, complete with pads, in building a zareba, but I hankered after ground less gruesomely reminiscent, so we compromised by turning our backs on the well and its immediate surroundings. "The animals always die at the end of this journey," said Suleiman calmly, "unless they are very strong. Then they drink so much water that one must travel very slowly, taking 5 days or even more to go from here to Hawari." The well, when we arrived, was a big mound of sand, but the guide told us it was properly made with stone walls, so it was only a case of digging. It is necessary to arrive at this well with a reserve of water, as, before beginning to dig, one must carefully soak the surrounding sand to make it hold the stones like mortar. Otherwise, they all fall in on top of anyone digging, and it is most dangerous work. Apparently the Zakar well was used in ancient days by Tibus, long before the Jagabub-Kufara route was opened by the Mahdi. The latter never traveled over it himself, but he sent an exploring party to discover its possibilities, and later his brother Sayyid Ahmad as-Sharif took a caravan across it. Since then, it has been practically reserved for the use of the Sanusi family, who make the journey with immense caravans with anything over 50 camels. They carry very large stores of fodder, casting several loads on the way if necessary. Sidi Idris and Sayyid Rida have so far avoided the route, but Sayyid Ahmad as-Sharif used it several times. On one occasion, some of his water went bad going south, and his horse died of thirst 4 days out. He had to leave most of his stores and luggage behind and return hastily to Jagabub with as many camels as possible. 3 years later, his luggage was recovered just as he had left it, which shows how little frequented is the route. All afternoon the Bedouins labored at the well. It was very narrow, about 2.5 feet across, so only old Suleiman, thin and weazened, could get down to dig. It must have been a most uncomfortable task, for the water lay at a depth of 15 feet. But before he slept that night, he had felt damp sand beneath his fingers. Next morning, January 29th, the work was completed and our 14 girbas filled and ranged in 2 nice, fat rows ready for loading. But we could not start that day, for a very bad sandstorm raged till 4 p.m. We could not light a fire or even go out to collect hatab for our journey. The camels moaned as they were huddled in a miserable circle, and we crouched under blankets and ate sand mixed with dates and stale bread. Hassanein devoted much labor to mending his primrose and scarlet boots with brass wire, and was bitterly disappointed because he could not cut the ladder with his saw. In the evening the wind abated a little, but it was a gloomy sunset. The sun was a livid disk in a pale green sky seen through a drab blur of sand above gray desert. We sealed up our 3 precious vanities with seccotine around the stoppers so that no one should be tempted to use them till the last possible moment. Then we recovered the well with old matting and skins we had found under the miniature dome which covered it. In 4 years the sand had filtered through them as if they were not there. But should any traveler be rash enough to follow shortly in our footsteps, our precaution might save him a repetition of old Suleiman's task. On January 30th, we began the long trek, leaving the well at 7 a.m. after a most careful adjustment of the loads. It was cold, with a faint north wind which strengthened as we mounted the stony gird northeast of the well. As we turned for a last look at the lonely clump of palms, a minute spot of green and a boundless stretch of undulating sand, a muffled voice came viciously from the many-colored kufiya which Hassanein had wound over his nose and mouth. "The one comfort is that we shall either be in Jagabub in 12 days or we shall be dead," it said. "Are your boots very painful with all that brass stuck in them?" I asked sweetly. For an hour we drove the camels slowly over rough, stony ground with large, loose slabs lying about. Then the hills gave place to the white sands, and we looked down onto dunes like the turbulent breakers of a stormy sea. Yusuf glanced solemnly at the last dark stones behind us. "We are lucky to leave the Red Country without exchanging gunpowder," he announced. "But the friends of the Sayyids are always blessed. You have been especially protected by Allah, for the Zuyas are a bad people." It was rare that the plump one was really serious, except when his food or sleep were threatened, so we guessed that he knew more than he would even tell us. The rising north wind, however, prevented much conversation, and before we had reached the first line of dunes, it had developed into something resembling the sandstorm of the previous day. It was bitterly cold. If one rode, the wind pierced through every blanket that could be wound around one, and one was nearly blown off the camel. If we walked with the gird muffled over our heads, the sand poured through the woolen stuff into eyes, mouth, and nose, and we literally staggered as we mounted each succeeding ridge and met the full force of the gale at the top. I used to struggle on for a mile or two, and then half bury myself under the lee of a gird till the stumbling, half-blinded caravan caught up.
A weary day was passed in repeating this process, until everyone looked upon the unfaltering guide as his personal enemy who would never stop his slow, interminable crawl over dune and hollow, which always kept him just out of reach of our protests. Every time he paused to look for the best place to cross a ridge, we hoped to hear the barracking cry, but always he shuffled on in broken sandals, monotonously, untiringly. The wind dropped at sunset, but we marched through the sickly, gray light with a faint lemon glow in the west, and only when the full 12 hours were completed did Suleiman allow us to crawl into our flea bags, half frozen, half starved, for everyone was too tired to cook. I believe I took off my boots, but certainly nothing else, for I remember how bulky my red hesam felt in the narrow space. But I slept for 9 blissful hours and ate far more than my share of sardines and dates in the morning. The rice was a strange blackish-gray color, due to the gerba water. The color and smell of this water after a few days are a great preventative of thirst. We had gone back to the old ration of 3 cups of water per day, with a 4th for cooking. We soon found that hot coffee made us too thirsty, but that cold, strong, sugarless tea produced rather the opposite effect. A much worse discovery greeted us that exceedingly cold morning of January 31st. 3 of the gerbas had either dried in the sand-filled wind or leaked away. There was scarcely the morning ration left in them. We spoke to the retinue seriously when we found them drinking copiously, but were baffled by their fatalism. We still had a gerba a day and 2 fanatis to spare, so they refused to consider the infinite possibilities of delay, illness, loss, leakage, or a camel needing water by the way. "What is written, said Yusuf. "You cannot run away from fate. That is what the eagle said to Suleiman." "What eagle?" I demanded suspiciously. The Prophet Suleiman was sitting on a hill from which he could see many cities, when an eagle came to him and said, "You think you are wise because you know the wisdom of all these people, but I will take you all over the world and show you the wisdom of countries you have never heard of." With that, he took the prophet's girdle in his beak and flew north, south, east, and west with him, showing him many marvels. When they had traveled far and wide, the bird flew back to the prophet's own country and dropped his pupil in a field where a plowman was setting snares. Before Suleiman could express his thanks, he saw that the great bird was caught in one of the traps and was battering helplessly against the bars. "O thou who wouldst teach me wisdom, where is thine own, that thou who knowest all in the world could not avoid one small trap?" "What is written, said the eagle resignedly. "One cannot run away from one's fate." Yusuf looked at me expectantly. "The eagle might have looked where he was going," I said firmly, "and you will most certainly look at what you are drinking, my son." Our start that morning was delayed because Suleiman's ear had to be doctored. A half-deaf as well as a half-blind guide was certainly a thing to be avoided, so we gave him all our spare undergarments, his ailment being entirely due to the fact that, with a temperature of 0, he slept on the cold sand in a ragged cotton shirt and a jerd transparently thin and tattered. He had started to walk more than 1,000 miles, including his return journey after he had taken the camels back to Jedabiyah, with no other possessions than these and not 1 nickel of money. "Allah is great. He will provide," he said simply as he wound my knitted spencer on his head and tied a pair of Hassanein's breeches around his chest under his grimy shirt. The Arab's one desire is to muffle every possible garment, no matter for what portion of the anatomy it is designed, round their heads and shoulders. The rest they leave to chance and the winds of heaven. Nature was evidently determined to show us everything she was capable of in the way of climate, for that day not a breath of wind stirred, and a torrid, aching sun beat down on us till our necks felt bruised and our heads heavy and unwieldy. We prayed for the night almost as fervently as the day before, especially as a completely new range of the exasperating Hawash Mountains appeared to the east. "After a day you will see them no more," said Mohammed consolingly. "But they say the dunes go west all the way to Misurata. Allah alone knows." After 3 hours' march, about 60 kilometers from Zakar, the dunes stopped altogether, and we crossed uneven stony ground till, an hour before sunset, we came to a single long line of huge, heavy dunes running west to east. They rose suddenly, like clear golden flour out of the dark stones, which went right up to their base, and though we followed them east for 14 kilometers that night, and 24 the next morning, we never saw them merge into the rocky waste. Always they stood apart, immense, curly, ridged, like waves of a sunlit sea, a beautiful landmark which can be seen half a day's journey ahead. It was warmer that night, and we fodled round a fire and ate Yusuf's asida, the only thing he liked better than camels, he told us, and listened to Suleiman's tales of past journeys. As they contained every form of disaster that can assail humanity in the clutches of remorseless nature, we turned the conversation till he spoke of people living on this desolate stony ground long, very long ago. There used to be wood here and forage, and there are stones stuck together with mortar, and sometimes one picks up prepared milling stones, which have been used for crushing grain. I doubted his facts because in the afternoon he had pointed out traces of what he thought were walls constructed with mortar, but I thought they were merely a natural formation of the sandstone which takes so many odd shapes. I think his milling stones were due to the hand of nature in fantastic mood, for there could never have been water in the stony ground. February 1st, we started at 7:15 a.m. and barracked at 2:30 p.m. at the Memsa, a feeding ground where it is customary to allow the camels a few hours' rest and a good meal before starting to cross the 4 days' waste in front without blade of grass or twig of firewood. A few camel skeletons mark the way below the towering dunes, and here and there one comes across large stones set on end by preceding travelers. These impromptu landmarks are of great value, and we religiously made them ourselves wherever possible. The Bedouins are very good about this labor. I have seen Muhammad toil to the top of some hillock with a heavy slab of rock after a long day's journey to make a mark that might cheer and guide a chance caravan years hence, perhaps. We crossed the dunes where a wide channel of stony ground ran into a low, curly ridge, and immediately on the other side found great shrubs and masses of dry, gray brush, excellent fodder and firewood, but burning hot at midday. The dunes circled round west and north of an open space of some 4 kilometers. Beyond this again there was another track of Hatab. Among this we camped and turned the camels loose to graze. They were disappointingly different. Inshallah, we shall arrive at Jagabub, but we shall leave 2 or 3 camels on the way, said Yusuf. We were very anxious about our animals. The 2 young Nagas were terribly thin, the big blonde camel was obviously ill, and 2 of the others were feeble and overworked. They should all have been rested and fed up at Kufara for at least another fortnight. We knew this at Taj, but the complicated politics of the place necessitated our precipitate departure. Yusuf told us that generally when a caravan travels the Kufara-Jagabub route, it spends a month at least in preparation. 40 or 50 camels are taken, and these are all fed up for weeks beforehand till they are very fat and strong. During that time they do no work, but are gradually trained to last 13 days without drinking by ever-increasing waterless periods. When our camels arrived at Kufara, they had done a hard 800 miles of journey, including one stretch of 10 days without water and 12 days without sufficient food, during the last 3 of which they were practically starving. After 9 days' rest, they had to start to cross one of the hardest routes in North Africa, overloaded and at a bad period of the year, when the climate is at its worst. We had, therefore, reason for our fears, and when the animals turned away from the plentiful fodder of the Memsa, our little party lost something of its high spirits. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. The Secret of the Sahara, Kufara, by Rosita Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Elusive Dunes.
Near the feeding ground are 2 large cisterns erected by order of Sayyid el-Mahdi. When any of the Senussi family wished to travel by this route, water was sent on ahead and stored in the cisterns, near which there is a small shanty falling into disrepair. As a matter of fact, there should undoubtedly be water at Mehemsa. It is the same sort of ground as at Butterfall and Zekar, and green bushes are plentiful and healthy. There is no rainfall and no dew to account for their existence otherwise. We also noticed a number of birds, conspicuous among them a gray and black variety larger than the Abu Fasada. In the time of Sidi el-Mahdi, slaves dug for water to a depth of 20 feet at the Mehemsa, without coming to wet sand, but since then no one has tried. On February 2nd, we started north at 6:30 a.m., after a violent argument as to the best way of saving the camels. I wanted to follow the summer plan, start an hour before sunset, walk all night, and camp 2 hours after dawn. One can do much longer marches this way, but the Bedouins were reluctant to face the cold of the night. On the other hand, Muhammad was desperately afraid of another sandstorm, which would inevitably delay us. He therefore wanted to walk at least 15 hours a day. It is an unfortunate fact that a camel does 13 hours at a pace of 4 kilometers infinitely easier than 10 hours at 5. He is capable of plodding along evenly without halting for an indefinite time, but the slower he goes, the longer he will last. Muhammad was a bad camelman. Frightened of the desperately long route in front of him, which had to be traversed in 12 days, he was anxious to push on at first in order to have something up his sleeve. Yet the loads, chiefly fodder and water, would grow lighter every day. I refused, therefore, to do more than 12 or 13 hours a day, especially as our camels would not feed properly when it was dark and cold. The best way of traveling is to start at 5 a.m., barrack for a few hours at midday, feed the camels as the afternoon grows cooler, and walk late into the night. But it means a double loading, and we had not enough man or energy for that, so our beasts had to accustom themselves to feeding by starlight, night and morning. That first day we had a cool wind, so we all walked cheerfully across the unbroken stretches of monotonous fawn sand. The world had become a level disk again, infinitely flat, its smoothness polished by the glaring sun till the mirage broke the edges, which seemed but a few yards away. I asked old Suleiman how he knew the way. You put Jedi over your left eye and walk a long way, thus. Then you turn a little toward the Qibla and walk still some more, and then, if Allah wills, you arrive. It was not exactly a reassuring answer after Abdullah's vagaries, so I asked him where Jedi was at the moment. I don't know, he replied with engaging frankness. Where is she? I showed him by the compass, and he trudged on perfectly placidly, nibbling a date from the little store he kept tied up in a corner of his tattered jerd. When the sunset had painted our narrow world flame red, and one by one the stars had come out to show how infinitely remote is that inverted bowl we call the sky, Muhammad pleaded for an extra spurt. Let us just put that star out, he urged, pointing to the brightest point in the west. Having noticed, however, that all the camels were stumbling and swinging out of line, I thought a race with the evening star would be a mistake, so I insisted on barracking. We made no zareba, leaving the loads ready coupled for the morning. We had taken very little hatab from the Mehemsa because of the weight, so our fire was of the smallest description, and we should have been asleep in an hour, but for a prolonged dispute between Muhammad and Suleiman as to the necessity of aggling the camels. They will not move, my son, said Suleiman. They are tired, like me, and I am an old man. Old, too, and experienced, replied our polite retainer, but make my heart at peace by aggling them. And he related a lurid story of how 70 camels had stampeded midway on the Zigan route. They all reached Jallo safely, but some of the men, unexpectedly left to carry their food and water, died on the march. Suleiman was already rolled like a dormouse between 2 hawiyas, so he appealed to me for support. "Know you the saying of the prophet, Uncle Suleiman?" I asked. "How a man came to him and asked whether he should aggle his camel or put his trust in Allah?" "First place the aggle on the camel, and then your trust in Allah," was the reply. Various grunts and roars mingled with my sleep told me that the guide had been impressed by my theological learning, and it seemed only a few minutes later that I awoke to the sound of Yusuf's voice. "Allah make you strong. Are you ready for rice?" Protesting that it must still be the middle of the night, I poked my head out of the flea bag, dislodging a shower of sand from its folds. A few yards away was one of the odd, vivid little pictures that flash suddenly into one's life and that one never forgets. A crackling, scented fire, criminally large in the circumstances, threw a wavering golden circle in the midst of a flat, shadowed sand, interminable, bournless. Against the brilliant stars a tall, white-robed figure was silhouetted, hands raised to heaven, white hood framing the stern, dark-featured face, intoning the dawn prayers. "Allahu Akbar!" rang out with undaunted faith, with undimmed courage, to the one guide whom the Bedouin trusts to lead his laboring caravans through the desert and dune to the desired oasis. Beside the glowing brushwood, Suleiman, bent double over a huge cauldron, monotonously pounded the morning zasida, his long pestle moving to the rhythm of his quavering chant, while Amar huddled under his coarse gourd, stirred red sauce flavored with fil-fil. Yusuf's plump face was set in immobile discontent against the flames, as, muffled in every conceivable garment and wrap, he methodically fed the fire, twig by snapping twig. White robes of fire and the paling stars, with a circle of camels looming formless and dark in the background, that was my picture, and then Yusuf's cross voice spoiled it. "The Gerba water is very bad," he said. "The rice will be black." "Malish, I shall not see it," I said, shivering. But a few minutes later we tasted it, when the plump one, sleepy-eyed, shuffled across with a grimy frying pan. He had sand on his nose and forehead to show that he had said his morning prayers, but whereas the rest of the retinue devoutly bowed their heads to the earth 3 times a day at least, I always suspected Yusuf of calmly dabbling a little shingle on his face as he went along. The hard-boiled eggs gave out that day, so we had to drown the taste of the Gerba rice with sardines. Our midday meal now consisted of dates and a handful of buksamat, for we had been given a couple of bags of these hard, unleavened biscuits, slightly sweetened and flavored with caraway seeds by the kindly Equan of Taj. In the evening we shared a tin of corned beef, but alas, our great support of the Tyserboat journey had failed us, for the dates we had brought from Hawari were too fresh, and they stung our mouths, blistering our gums, and reducing us to agonies of thirst. The water allowance was too small to allow of our drinking except in the morning and in the evening, so we had reluctantly to discard our dates. Yusuf insisted on eating one only each day because there is an Arab proverb, "A date by the way, or a young girl smiling, makes a fortunate journey." We started at 6:30 a.m. on February 3rd and walked till 7 p.m., when the whole party, men and camels alike, sat down and groaned. It had been absolutely torrid, without a breath of wind. The girbas began to look distinctly thin, and the clank of the water in the fanatis showed that a good deal had evaporated. Unfortunately, it had been very cold after the sandstorm the evening before our departure from the Zakar well, and the camels had not drunk properly. Yusuf had made gloomy prognostications most of the day, and when we came to a mound of sand which had drifted over a few old hawiyas thrown away by a former caravan, he poked them viciously. "How many of our own shall we throw in this way?" he asked of fate. There is no logic in desert weather. After midday heat we had a very cold night. I remember I ate my chilly dinner with my gloves on, and was not surprised to find there was frost, when a sudden storm of shouts and roars brought me rapidly out of my flea bag, and I fell over the thermometer in the dark. The camels apparently had gone wildly mad, for in spite of their aggles they were all hobbling and hopping wildly around, making immense noise, which the retinue were exceeding in their anxiety to drive the beasts away from our neatly arranged girbas, protected, as usual at night, by a hedge of baggage saddles. February 4th saw us away by 6:15, a good effort, chiefly due to a loading race between Ammar and Yusuf against the guide and Mohammed. I think the former couple won, but all the loads were a little wobbly that day. A black duck flew low across our path, heading north. "It has gone into the upside-down country," said Suleiman, pointing ahead. And there, on the far horizon, we saw pale dunes and ridges, clear-cut, with violet shadows below peak and cliff. They looked but a few hours' march away, and we were all immensely happy, though we knew they were more than a day's journey away. Again it was very hot, but Yusuf, who always enjoyed a burning sun, took it upon himself to cheer up the whole party. When a camel lay down and groaned, he carefully made a row of toy asadas in the sand, modeling the little hole at the top for a sauce with infinite trouble. "These are for him to eat, then he will be strong again," he said, smiling. When Suleiman complained of his eyesight, the plump one cried, "I will ride ahead and see the way." And, mounting his stick, he gambled around, imitating every trick and gesture of horsemanship with perfect art. Finally, when the rest of us were so oppressed by the heat that we only wondered what we could take off next, we saw Yusuf solemnly fill the skirt of his shirt with sand and begin sowing it like grain right and left. "What on earth are you doing, you man?" exclaimed Mohammed. "The next traveler will find a patch of green grain and will be happy," he said placidly. Nevertheless, that night, when the elusive dunes had failed to materialize, even as shadows on the horizon, anxiety spread. Hassanein balanced himself perilously upright on the back of the Tibu beast, but could report nothing in sight, so consoled himself by remending his yellow shoes. All the afternoon there had been a dispute as to whether we should go east or west of certain invisible dunes, and the retinue disagreed violently as to how soon we ought to see these landmarks or in what direction they were. Therefore, I was not surprised when I heard a bitter argument behind me. Reproaches were being hurled at Suleiman, who replied that he was old and could not see. "He has lost the—" wailed Mohammed. "We must stop. He cannot go on." Yusuf joined in. "Is he sure he has lost it? Think, you man. Let him think, I tell you." Expostulation and suggestion followed in loud chaos. I had coped with one such dispute on the morning when there should have been a ridge to the left and there wasn't. I determined that Hassanein should struggle with this. Slightly deaf, he was nodding over his shoemaking far ahead on the gray camel. I rushed up to him crossly. "Get down at once," I urged, seizing the beast ruthlessly by the neck and feeling angrier than ever at the sight of Hassanein's mildly surprised and protesting face, as he desperately clutched his boots and the nearest supporting rope in preparation to being forcibly barracked. "Pull yourself together. Suleiman has lost the way. They are all fighting desperately. If it's an important landmark he's missed, we had better wait till the morning. For heaven's sake, hurry." One anguished glance at the angry group in the rear, who were all pointing backwards, was sufficient to make Hassanein swing off without question. I watched him literally propel himself into the argument, heard "Wallahi" furiously repeated, his hands flung skyward, and then, surprised, saw him extricate himself from Mohammed's detaining hands and walk slowly back to his camel, methodically picking up the possessions he had ruthlessly scattered at my peremptory request. "Well, what is it? What has he lost?" I shouted impatiently. Hassanein has waited till he was quite near, and then he gave me a withering look and said very slowly, each word enunciated separately, "It is a small leather bag which the Kaimakan gave him to sell in Jagabub. Suleiman has left it behind." On February 5th, we broke camp at 6:30, singularly indifferent to coffee mysteriously mixed with candle grease and rice, hairy with gerba fur in our anxiety to see the morning mirage. This time the dunes looked even nearer. One could see the wavy furrows along the ridges and every separate golden hillock. Yet an hour later, everything had vanished and the flat, fawn disk stretched drab and monotonous on every side. Suleiman was confident, however, that we should sleep in the dunes that night. Yusuf was cheerfully certain that, as we had not yet seen the Mosul ridge to the west, we should not see land for another day. When Bedouins are traveling across a big, trackless desert, they always speak of any known country as the land. It is rather like a long sea voyage with the guide as the pilot. He keeps the caravan's head turned in the right direction by the stars and waits to pick up a familiar landmark before making directly for his oasis. At 10 a.m. the old guide uttered something nearly resembling a shriek and threw himself on Yusuf's neck. "I see the Mosul," he exclaimed, "and it is near, very near." Leaving the pale line of distant hillocks to our left, we headed directly north towards other dunes which began to appear, a faint blur on the horizon. The two little Nagas edged away to the west all day in the most determined way. Yusuf said they knew that their mothers, from whom we had separated them at Taj, were now traveling on the Ziganjala route, and instinct was driving them towards the soldier-slaves caravan. The plump one's character always appeared to greater advantage in really hard times. When things were going easily, his scowl was a marvel of discontented endurance. His eyes shut into little slits, and his voice became a plaintive whine. When big difficulties arose, when camels were failing and everybody was overtired, Yusuf cheered up the whole caravan. His absurd little songs trickled out hour after hour. He told long fairy stories about giants and princesses. He made elaborate jokes which we daily received with new interest. Thus, if anyone lagged behind, they were always greeted when they rejoined the caravan as if after a long absence, upon which they replied that they had come from Jedabiyah or Jallo in 2 or 3 days, were congratulated on their walk, and asked minutely for news concerning every person in the place. This particular game never wearied, and we all grew most inventive at the expense of the good folk at Jedabiyah. One would think that in 13 hours' walk each day, one would find time for much conversation. But the desert breeds reserve. It is so big that one's own plans and projects seem too little to be talked about. Also, there is so much time to say anything that one continually puts it off and ends by never saying it at all. We used to walk for hours without a word, till Yusuf broke the silence by some reflection on his approaching marriage, or the sickness that he saw in some camel's eye. By this time I had learned how to make myself understood in Libya. The nouns are nearly all different, but after one has learnt a list of those, one gets on very nicely with but 2 verbs. To express any more or less peaceful occupation, like traveling, stopping, loading, unloading, letting fall, starting, etc. ad infinitum, one employs the word shil. If one wishes to imply any more vigorous or offensive action, like fighting, attacking, climbing hurriedly, eating, burning, becoming angry, a kal seems to be elastic enough to express it. We finally arrived at the dunes nearly 2 hours before sunset, luckily hitting 2 very big dunes that were well-known landmarks. Yusuf wanted to turn in behind them. Suleiman insisted on going on to the right, which brought us into a wide, flat stretch some 12 kilometers long. We barracked at the end of it, in a rising wind, which soon put out our little folding lantern, so that we lost everything, including the tin opener, in the dark. It was rather a miserable night, for the hatab we had brought from Ahimsa was exhausted, and our efforts to make tea over a little fire of leaf torn from one of the hawiyas were not very successful. The water from the gerba we opened that night was really bad. Its color and taste alike were extraordinary, so we regretfully decided to use it only for cooking. Suleiman looked at it with interest. "We have enough water, alhamdulillah," he said. "In any case, I can live for a week without drinking." When we questioned him as to this amazing statement, he told us that Sidi al-Mahdi habitually sent out caravans to explore the country around Kufara. Suleiman, an old man and a boy, had formed one of these parties,
and they had wandered as far afield as Merg, 13 days southeast of their starting point, when one dark night their camels were stolen by a band of brigands. Presumably something happened to the gerbas and provisions, for in the morning the exploring party found themselves with enough water and dates for a day and a half, and they were 6 days' journey from the nearest well, the Owinat. However, the three started off to walk it, actually carrying their rifles. The old man got ill after 1 day and insisted on being left behind. After 2 days, his erstwhile companions discarded their rifles. After 3, Suleiman got fever and lay down to die, but the boy went on and arrived safely at the well. Our guide unexpectedly recovered from his fever after 24 hours and started off again, walking only at night and lying down all day. He arrived at Owinat on the 7th day, so exhausted and so parched with thirst that he could not get the liquid down his throat, so he lay in the water in the well for a whole day and was then able to drink. Luckily, a caravan had thrown away some dates, and with a small store of these and a little water he could carry, Suleiman calmly walked on to Kufara, another week's journey. The old man, who had been left to die on the road, arrived a day later with his rifle. The feat seems inconceivable, but Yusuf vouched for the truth of the story, and Ammar told how he had drunk only once in 72 hours when the water in the Gerba went bad. Then Mohammed, not to be outdone in endurance, related how he had traveled from Jallo to Jagabub in 4 days and 4 nights, without sleeping, eating as the camels went along, because the Gerbas were all leaking and he was afraid of running short of water. By this time we felt that our own little effort to draw a new red line across the survey map was very small and insignificant, and that we should certainly be able to walk to Jagabub carrying a fanatis and a tin of corned beef if necessary. We were much less confident of it next morning, however, when all the camels turned up their noses at the date food we offered them and deliberately ran away. There was nowhere for them to run to among the dunes, so we got them back after a laborious half-hour. But I felt that the word Agal and not Kufara would be written across my heart in the future. There was no fire that morning, and uncooked soaked rice is not appetizing. I remember I was tying the remains of my stockings around my feet when I heard a gloomy voice say, "We ate the last box of sardines last night because you lost the beef tin opener in the sand and the rice is coal black. I wish you would not be so miserly with a fanatis water." I didn't pay much attention as I hadn't any more stockings. Evidently the primrose and scarlet boots which I had bought for 4 medjidies, 16 shillings, at Joff were not suited for walking, for I had been wearing 2 pairs of woolen stockings, one over the other, and now they all hung in shreds around my feet. However, I did look up when the plaintive tones continued. "I've found 1 sardine. He must have fallen out when you upset the canteen in the sand." With horror I saw a sodden, dark mass, and on the top of it a minute yellow block shaped like a fish, but I did not like to be discouraging. "Are you sure that there is a sardine inside that sand?" I asked diffidently. Hassanein was offended. "Will you carve him, or shall I?" he asked majestically. On February 6th, we plunged right into the dunes. On the whole, they ran north to south in great wavy ridges which would be impossible for camels to cross. In between were wide stretches of rolling ground, rising gradually to lower dunes through which Suleiman confidently picked his way. The little old man was very calm. "I have never been this route before, but if I keep Jedi in my left eye, we shall arrive, inshallah," he said. And when Yusuf complained violently that there was no hatab, the retinue had eaten raw flour and water that morning, he answered simply, "Allah will bring provisions." A few minutes later we came upon a camel skeleton, a most welcome sight, for it proved we were on the right track. Inside the ribs were some large slabs of dried dung. Muhammad pulled us out triumphantly. "A fire! A fire! Alhamdulillah!" And therefore everyone was cheerful till Ammar brought the news that Yusuf was ill. We had seen the plump one lie down some way in the rear, but thought he was only resting for half an hour, a thing we all did in turns. Only the difference between the nature of the East and West showed at these moments, for whereas the Bedouins slept peacefully in the rear and then ran after the camels, I used to toil on ahead and lay myself across the path of the caravan so that I must wake at its approach. It appeared that Yusuf had fallen down and then lost consciousness for about an hour. It was very lucky that he managed to catch up with the caravan at all. We mounted him on the Tibu camel, which was the strongest of the caravan, but was already showing signs of thirst, and toiled on. It was much harder walking in the dunes, for the sand was soft and deep in patches, but the great curly ridges, golden as Irish butter, which Yusuf always looked at affectionately, because they reminded him of his beloved Asita, were friendly spirits after the dreary disk of the preceding 4 days. It was always a thrilling moment when one mounted a high gird, for there was the possibility of a view. Logically, one could expect to see only waving yellow crests, a sunlit expanse of sand valley and mountain in every direction, but the impossible might always happen. One might espy a caravan, or an oasis, or at least some hatab. For this reason, we always hastened ahead up the big rises to look down on wind-tossed ranges, and toward the evening we were rewarded for our energy by the appearance of little black specks in one of the hollows. "Hatab," said Suleiman laconically. Yusuf recovered at the word, or perhaps it was the quinine which we had given him earlier in the day. We raced down to the brittle stalks of twisted, coarse-grained wood that meant fires and hot food that night, and everyone began to talk of what they would eat. Just after sunset, we came to an almost perpendicular dune which the camels refused to descend. We had to dig a sloping trough down it and push the beasts into it one by one. Everybody was tired, and the camels were incredibly stupid. The young Nagas simply rolled down, flinging their loads in front of them, at which Mohammed lost his temper and made matters worse by violently beating the animals, still hesitating at the top. They stumbled forward in a huddled mass, and I saw the Gurbas threatened. Luckily, the Tibu beast was carrying most of them. He plunged solidly down on his great splay feet, and I had just enough energy left to seize his head rope and drag him out of the chaos. We barracked before our short-sighted guide could lead us over another such precipice, and because it was a joy to be wasteful of anything on that journey, we made no fewer than 3 fires and recklessly poured everything we could find into the frying pan together, rice and corned beef and tinned turnips, so that we ate a hot, very hot meal. We even drank our 1 cup of tea hot, debating the while whether coffee were not preferable, for, though it made one thirsty, it somewhat hid the taste of the gerba water. Everything by now tasted slightly of wax, for in the hot days all the candles had melted in the canteen. It is certainly possible to clean pots and pans beautifully with sand, but it needs a great deal of energy to do it, and I defy anyone to have any superfluous energy after loading and feeding camels before a 12 to 13 hours march, unloading and feeding the tired and smelly beasts at the end of it, haggling them while they persistently tried to escape, preparing some sort of a meal, and then, worst of all, oh, intolerably worst, the sand rash that tortured our nights. Let no one who dreams of a poetic Swinburnian desert come to Libya. We had not washed anything but our hands since leaving Hawari 13 days before, and not even these since the Zakar well. Since then we had had a sandstorm which filled every pore with minute grit, so that by day the irritation was just bearable, but at night, in the warmth and the restricted space of the flea bag, it was a torture beyond belief. I used to feel that never, so long as I lived, would I be able to bear seeing water spilled or wasted. Fate had been cruel to us in one respect, for the day at the Zakar well, when we had dreamed of sandy baths in the canteen lid behind a friendly palm tree, she had sent us the first of our 2 sandstorms, so washing had been confined to a teacup for our fingers. One lay at night, sleepless and burning, and looked up at the aloof peace of the stars and wondered vindictively how one could get even with the desert for this last trick of hers. Yet in the cold, still dawn, the desperate tiredness vanished, and one made a huge, unnecessary fire to breakfast by, and ate black rice with immense relish. Yusuf was very proud of his skill as a cook, so we did not like to tell him of all the foreign bodies we found in our food, bits of leaf and straw from the baggage saddles, grit, hair, pebbles, and sand. It was the Libyan sauce, and I think Hassanein suffered much in silence, for it was his first desert journey, and he still hankered after cleanliness. I used to find him desperately and secretly rubbing a plate with a corner of his muffler or his best silk handkerchief, and whenever he was late for breakfast, I knew it was because he had been unwise enough to look at his cup or fork before using them. On our second day in the dunes, the flat spaces grew rarer, so that we climbed up and down ridges most of the time. The camels began to show signs of wear. One of the Nagas trailed her head most of the time. The big blond beast had to be relieved of his load. They were all very smelly, which is the first sign of thirst. Luckily, we found patches of green hatab, the prickly, juiceless bush of the Hamsa, scattered under the dunes. The animals raced to it, fighting for the freshest tufts. Amar got fever and had to be allowed to ride, while I was so tired that I found a way of festooning myself over the pegs of the baggage saddles, my knees wound round one and my neck around the other. In this extraordinarily uncomfortable position I actually dozed, while Yusuf wandered beside me doubtfully. "You are very long," he said politely. "I think you will fall." And he tried to double up a dangling foot, much as if it was a piece of baggage slipping. I could not understand the presence of green bushes till I found my pillow that night wet with a heavy dew. Then I realized that we had left the southern lands behind us, and next day, February 8th, there were a few little clouds in the sky, just specks of fluffy white, but we had become used to the molten blue that roofs the red country of Kufara and her encircling wastes. That was, for me, the worst day. The little camels persistently threw their loads, ill-balanced because the fodder had become so much lighter. There was a cold east wind which blistered one's skin on one side, while the sun scorched it on the other. The camels would not keep together, but strayed off to each patch of green. The dunes seemed steeper than ever, and the sand softer and heavier. No one was sure of the way. Even Suleiman was a little depressed at not picking up any of the landmarks he had known on previous journeys. He insisted on keeping his course due north, though we knew Jagabub lay northeast, and his only explanation was that it was easier to approach the place from the west. Logically, I thought it would be easier to strike east, so that if one went past Jagabub, one would at least reach Siwa. To the west lay only the 7 days' waterless stretch to Jallo. However, Suleiman was immovable, and we plodded wearily on, placing one foot in front of the other with desperate firmness, and flinging ourselves flat on our faces for a few minutes' blessed sleep whenever the camels lingered to feed. I remember wondering, as I dragged myself up after one of these short respites, how many separate and distinct aches one body could feel at the same moment. I was getting quite interested in the problem when Hassanein's bronzed face, it seemed to have grown hollow these last few days, appeared beside me. He was painfully shuffling on blistered feet after a 12 hours walk the previous day. "When we get to Cairo, everyone will say, 'What fun you must have had,'" he said drearily. Even this idea could not make me speak. I had discovered it was easier to walk with my eyes shut, and so mutely I shuffled after the guide, dragging my stick till I dropped it and was too tired to pick it up again. Yes, it was a bad day, but it ended at last with a few patches of black pebbles, sure sign that we were nearing the northern edge of the dunes. Even the sandrash, combined with a most remarkable tasting dish produced by Hassanein's efforts to clean the frying pan, could not keep me awake that night, and I slept soundly, till Yusuf's plaintive voice, saying all in one breath, "All to make you strong, the fire is ready for the rice," roused me to a starry world, and an exceedingly damp one. But I imagine these very heavy dews helped the thirsty camels considerably,
so I didn't regret a wet barracan which twisted itself reluctantly around everything but me. February 9th was memorable, for on climbing the high dune under which we had camped, we saw a long, faint ridge, blue on the northeast horizon. "Land at last," exclaimed Mohammed. "It must be the mountain between Jagabub and Siwa." Even this reassuring suggestion would not turn our guide from his northerly course, but signs that we were leaving the great desert abounded. So far, the only living things had been large, unpleasant beetles, mottled black and fawn creatures, some nearly 4 inches long, which looked like scattered stones till they suddenly raised themselves on long legs and scuttled away. That morning, however, we saw many black and gray birds, and at last, when the green patches of haddam had developed into large, brown-like shrubs and neat little dwarf trees, leafless and but 2 or 3 feet high, we came across gazelle traces. We also found 2 complete skulls with the tapering horns in perfect condition. The country was changing noticeably. The previous day there had been a few patches of the Jagabub gray stone among the sand, the sight of which filled the retinue with delight. On February 9th, great blocks of it appeared in fantastic masses rising suddenly from dune and hollow. We noticed scattered pieces of fossilized wood, some of which appeared to have been parts of the trunks of big trees. Stretches of what looked like black pebbles shimmered dark beyond the farthest ridge. Finally, Mohammed, mounting an immense curly-backed sand peak at noon, tore off his turban, tied it around his staff, and, waving it banner-wise above his head, shouted wildly, "I see my country, the land is near." The camels were the only indifferent beings in the caravan. They were too tired to quicken the pace, which had dropped to 2 miles an hour during the last day or 2. They had got very thin, with dull eyes, but luckily there was a slight breeze to relieve the intense heat which scorched us whenever we stopped for grazing in a hollow. There were streaks of white cloud in the pale sky, and I imagined a breath of salt flavored the northern breeze, so that suddenly I was desperately homesick for the great free desert, lawless and boundless, that we were leaving. Ahead were the comfortable lands where the nomads camp in their tattered nugas, and the Bedouin pasture their herds, the Gebel Akbar and Cyrenaica, the welcome of the tent dwellers, for all caravans who have traveled the big routes. "Somewhere east of us," said the compass. "North of us," said Suleiman, "lay the last outpost of the wilderness, if not the birthplace, at least the training ground of Sanusiism." But the lure of space dragged one's mind back. The claw of the desert was tearing away the peace that should lie at a journey's end. I do not think I ever felt mentally flatter than when, just before 2 a.m., we passed through the last little hollow where green and gold were mixed, and the mighty belt of dunes lay behind us. In front was a most desolate country of gray slate and streaks of white chalky sand and pebbles, with here and there a dull madder gird or stony cliff. A faint thrill of interest was given to the moment by the fact that none of the retinue knew where we were, but as I was determined that east we should now go, whatever they said, it did not much matter. Suleiman climbed one dune and said we were between the hatias of Bu Alia and Bu Salama on the Jala road. Mohammed climbed another and said that both these places were to the east of us. Yusuf lay down firmly on a soft spot and said that all known country was still to the north, and he was going to sleep till the guide found his head again. The happy-go-lucky Bedouin spirit had completely got possession of us, so no one was particularly surprised when, after an hour on the course insisted on by the compass and myself, we picked up a definite trail with some slabs of stone stuck upright as landmarks. As a matter of fact, we had struck the Jalo-Jagabub route rather more than a day's journey west of the latter place, but at the time nobody was certain as to our exact position. Amar, however, announced that undoubtedly Bu Alia lay behind us, and no sooner had the whole retinue agreed on that one point than the beginning of the hatia of that name became visible a few hundred yards ahead. "Hamdalillah, we shall camp tonight in our own country," exclaimed Mohammed, and hurried on the caravan in spite of Yusuf's expostulations. Gazelle tracks were now plentiful, and we tried to track down 4 in the hope of getting a shot, but Suleiman was nearly dead beat. "The last word is in your hands," he said, "but I am an old man and very tired. Let us barrack here." The Hatia was really a wadi, stretching about 5 kilometers north to south, with a breadth of 4 kilometers. The whole space between the white shale and sandbanks was filled with mounds and shrubs of hatab, mostly green, while here and there massive blocks of grayish sandstone stuck up in strange shapes. As one wandered slowly through the low bushes, far away to the north a long purplish ridge with a mound at the end shaped exactly like the dome of a mosque caught the first red of the sunset. "That is the gird of the Quba," explained Yusuf, his round, tired face lighting up. "And look, in front of us is the Gara of Sidi el-Mahdi." At the farthest end of the Hatia was an immense block of red sandstone flung up by the hands of some forgotten giant upon a mighty base of polished white, so that it looked like a primeval altar to the gods of earth and sky. Here the Mahdi used to halt his immense caravans on the Jallo journey, and under the shadow of the rough natural sanctuary pray for a prosperous venture or give thanks for a safe return. Even Suleiman spoke no more of barracking. Without a word spoken, everyone felt that the Maghrib prayers must be said where the spirit of the Mahdi would surely welcome travelers from the far-off oasis, whose red and amber he had changed to wealth of grain and fruit and flowers. The weary camels were hurried from their indifferent nibbling along the dry shrubs, when the full glory of the golden west lit up the strange altar, balanced between heaven and earth, and the faint silver crescent of a new moon glowed pale amidst the flame. We came round the corner of the rock and saw the simplest Qibla that ever the faithful turned towards the Kaaba. It was but 3 great rough boulders, with a circle of stones to mark the shape of an imaginary mosque. Yet it was holy ground, and we left our worn shoes outside before we bowed our faces to the desert sands. What prayers the stern Mohammed mixed in with his, "In the name of Allah, compassionate and merciful," I know not. What simple thanksgivings were murmured by our weather-beaten guide, if the young Zawiya student Amar grasped the perils from which he had been protected, if Yusuf's mind realized for one fleeting moment that there was something beyond his comfortable practicality, I cannot guess. But I know that never in my life have I offered more whole-hearted gratitude to the power that, called by many different names in many different cities, is omnipotent in the deserts. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Secret of the Sahara, Kufara by Rosita Forbes. Chapter 15. The End of the Journey. We camped that night at Bu Salama, the next Hatia on the way to Jagabub. The wood was too green to make really good fires, though Mohammed and Hassanein labored manfully in the sand. The rest of us were too tired to care what happened, provided we could lie down and not move for hours and hours. The gray camel evidently shared our feelings, for he had fallen in barracking. Amar, hopping round him distressfully without making the slightest attempt to help the rider, called repeatedly on the name of Sidi el-Mahdi. It is amazing the complete faith every Sanusi has in the spiritual and mental power of the Sayyids. Whenever the young Nagas ran away, old Suleiman used to stand perfectly still and repeat urgently, "Influence of the Sidi Idris, influence of the Sidi Idris." Once, while sleeping perilously in a more than usually odd position, I nearly fell as my camel stumbled down a dune. Yusuf muttered the name of every Sayyid living and dead to ensure my safety. I have never traveled in any country so united in devotion to its ruler as Libya. Presumably, Sidi Idris is somewhat less powerful than Allah in the eyes of the Sanusi, but he is nearer at hand. Their confidence in his capabilities is so unbounded that it must occasionally embarrass the Sayyid himself. From curing a camel 1,000 miles away to stopping a sandstorm, from conquering the world to producing a well where there is no water, all are within the power of the son of the Sidi al-Mahdi. Our own prestige as friends of so important and puissant a personage was, therefore, considerably lowered when we humbly suggested that the retinue had better leave their varied armory in Jagabub, as we could not guarantee that the Egyptian frontier authorities would allow them to enter Siwa. Yusuf looked blank. "But you will write a letter," he suggested. He knew the all-powerful, almost magical effect of a missive from Sidi Idris in Libya, and reasoned that his guests could surely arrange the simple affair of the rifles in their own country by putting pen to paper. When we confessed our impotence, he entertained the gravest doubts as to our position and respectability. We had decided to send Muhammad on to Jagabub before sunrise, so that we might sleep next night in an house. Therefore, long after I had retired into my flea bag, I saw Hasanain and Yusuf struggling to shave our delightful retainer by the light of the campfire, with a safety razor blade held in a pair of pliers. Suleiman and Ammar offered interested suggestions, interspersed with remarks on the number of gray hairs which had resulted from the journey. In spite of the 8 hours' journey ahead, Muhammad donned his best clothes to present himself at the Zawiya where he had been educated. Therefore, I was surprised when Yusuf started next morning in his ragged white shirt and patched waterproof. "I always ride the last day of a journey," he announced firmly, depositing himself on the least weary camel. We broke camp at 7 a.m. and straggled slowly by dreary gray gourds and uneven stretches of colorless sands and stones to a small hatia, Mahet Hafan, where a few palms grew among more fantastic boulders. The heat was intense as we entered a country of low white hillocks, with slabs of shale that made the camels stumble more than ever. But the end came with unexpected rapidity, for after the guide had told us under a noon sun that it was a long day's march to Jagabub, Yusuf spied the white Quba of the Zawiya from a friendly gird. In a few minutes the whole round wadi spread before us, with its strips of scattered palms and brushwood, and beyond a line of square sandstone cliffs the white walls of Jagabub that looked so near and that took us more than 2 hours to reach. The home of Sidi bin Ali is by far the most picturesque of the Senussi oases, for it is blinding white in the sunshine, a smooth polished cupola and tall madna, with the open-arched gallery of Sidi Idris's house rising above the massive fortress-like walls of the Zawiya, all white, white as the windmills that look like marble pillars in the distance, or the pale sand bricks of the few big houses that surround the Zawiya. Jagabub is not a town in the proper sense of the word. It is one immense building with thick, windowless walls, surrounding a maze of courts, passages, schools, lodgings for students, the big houses of the Senussi family, and the large mosque and Quba of Sidi bin Ali. It stands on a cliff from which flights of steps lead down to palm gardens and the one big well that supplies water to the whole settlement. Outside the massed, many-storied buildings of the Zawiya are a few scattered houses, but Jagabub is a university, pure and simple. When Sidi al-Mahdi removed his headquarters to Kufara, he freed 100 slaves, giving them the gardens that they cultivated and ordering that their rights should be respected by his successors. So now there is a colony of these liberated blacks who live among the palms in the wadi. They work hard in their vegetable gardens, which are irrigated by an excellent system of channels and reservoirs dependent on the spring below the Zawiya, and they sell their dates and produce to the college. 2 of the students met us halfway across the wadi with a note from Muhammad saying that rooms were being prepared for us in the Zawiya, and Yusuf promptly proceeded to change his clothes. He tore off his tattered shirt, baring a muscular brown torso to the public gaze. He produced a mysterious bundle from a sack on my camel and shook from it embroidered waistcoat, silk jerd, yellow shoes, and immaculate white linen, all of which he donned as we walked along. When the white walls were very near, We fired our revolvers into the air to announce our arrival, and Mohammed came out to meet us, smiling broadly. We passed through a big white arch into a wide open space with a well in the middle, round which were clustered groups of students who gave us warm greeting. To the right rose the solid, castle-like wall of Sidi Idris's house, whose gallery on the other side looked down onto a beautiful square court of the Quba, with its wide-arched and columned arcades. The facade near the square is pierced by a few shuttered windows and the carved main door through which one goes to the Quba court. To the left, the square was bordered by a row of neat, little round lintel doors, each with a slit of a window above it, the lodging houses for the students. A big two-storied house rose beyond, and, at the door of this, we were met by a delightful old man with pale, thin face, a long beard as white as his woolen jerd, or the colorless walls behind him. "Greeting to you in the peace of Allah," he said, and led us into a dwelling more complicated even than the Kaimakan's house of many courts at Taj. We went up and down little flights of steps, which seemed to exist without reason, under low arches, by odd little passages and mud-floored yards, till a longer staircase led us to a flat roof, across which we followed our host to a large, high room, matted and carpeted, but devoid of furniture. For the first time I lived in an Arab house which had a view from the windows, for here there was no yard to shut one into a mysterious little world of secluded privacy. From the cross-barred windows with swinging shutters, one looked down on the big square and the white figures gossiping around the well, or across to the group of our weary camels, literally bulging after their enormous drink, to students seated at the doors of their rooms with Koran and rosary. Our host, Sidi Yaram Bougamira, one of the important Ekwan, was so anxious to hear the complete story of our journey that he would not leave us before we had drunk sweet coffee, seated on his best carpet, and answered all his questions as to why we had come from Kufara by such a hard route. Before we had satisfied his kindly curiosity, Sidi El-Fagel, plump and ebony-faced, with graying mustache, the imam of the mosque, and other Ekwan, had hurried to visit us. I was so tired I could hardly hold up my head. My nose was blistered and peeling, my face burning, my eyes watering. I was intensely hungry. Every nerve seemed to be throbbing and aching, and above all, I was conscious of dirt. I felt completely vague as I leaned against the wall, and when a murmur of voices below suggested the possibility of other visits, I basely left Hassanine to entertain the venerable Ekwan, and crept down a discreet little stairway to a quaint-shaped room that lurked under one of the innumerable archways, forgotten, I think, by the architect, who must have had a most tortuous mind. It was full of dust and clay, but I felt a little more dirt did not matter, and here I was found by the kindly Yusuf, when the last visitor had gone, fast asleep on Hassanine's grimy jerd. "The Sit Karaja must eat," he said. "The Wakil of Sidi Idris has sent you dinner." The magic word roused me, and the sight of a gleaming brass tray set on a little table 6 inches high in the middle of our unbroken sea of carpet finished the cure. When we lifted the palm leaf covers from the bowls, we found eggs, pigeons, and vegetables cooked in wonderful savory sauces, with piles of most delicious bread, brown and flaky. But alas, every cunning sauce was so impregnated with red pepper that we had most gingerly to remove the pigeons and dust them carefully before eating, after which we regretfully deposited a just proportion of the rest of the meal in a carefully prepared hole in the backyard, lest the feelings of our host be hurt. We had just removed all traces of our villainy when he appeared to drink tea with us. Sidi Hussain, the Wakil, was, of all the hosts who generously entertained us on behalf of the Sayyids, the most delightful, because he was the most simple. Jagabub is not a political or mercantile center like Kufara or Jallo. It has all the dreaming peace of a little university town, only its dons are reverend, gray-bearded sheiks in flowing white jerds over grass-green or indigo-blue robes. Its undergraduates are graver figures with books and beads
than those of Trinity or the House, while the scouts, I suppose, are the black slaves of hideous aspect who live in a special court of the Zawiya. But I feel sure they are more industrious and certainly more frugal than their English counterparts on the banks of the Isis and Cam. Sidi Hussain made tea with a formality as deliberate as that of the Kaimakam at Taj, but his conversation was much less ceremonious. There was no rigid etiquette observed in a series of questions and answers. For once, the undercurrent of suspicion and unrest was absent, and we curled up our mental antennae with a feeling of complete peace. The little town, so aloof from the world in its secluded wadi, yet the nursery of a great confraternity where still is nourished a force whose influence is felt all along North Africa, wished us well. A very intimate friendliness pervaded the gathering in the semi-gloom of the candle-lit room. The wakil's huge beard flowed gray and soft over dark jubba with a many-colored waistcoat beneath, but there was no lavish display of silk or embroidery, because the Ekhwan of Jagabub are more devoted to learning than to luxury. "We are poor men who spend our time in prayer," said one of them with the utmost simplicity and a dreamy look in his faded old eyes. Their great pride is their kuba, and a reflection for this homage showed in Yusuf's face when, the night after our arrival, just as I had finished scrubbing off the first layer of grime, and wondering if I could decently ask Amar to heat another quart or two of water, he arrived with a guttering candle to suggest that I should go at once to see the sanctuary. "There will be no people there at this hour," he said. But when we had crossed the starlit square and left our shoes inside the first arcade of the mosque, we heard a low, monotonous chanting coming from the shadows beyond the great white court. It was in keeping with the solemn spirit of the night and the scene and the proud happiness in Yusuf's face as he led me through long, dim ways which he trod unfaltering, back again in imagination in his boyhood's days, when perhaps he had been as earnest and devout a learner as the grave-faced students who passed us in the square. Through a fine carved and painted door we passed into the mosque, very quiet, white, and dignified, the dark carpets on the floor the only rich note to break its utter simplicity. The silence began to beat on my eardrums with the impression of so many prayers, hopes, resolves, fervently uttered by youth in these low aisles, remembered again by age when it revisited the earliest center of its faith. Yusuf did not break it. Eyes bright with a light I had never seen in them before, he beckoned me on into the kuba itself, and we stood in a painted chamber, ornate with gold and many colors, below the big dome, hung with huge, finely molded glass lamps. I murmured swift Arabic prayers before a square grid of carved bronze that surrounded the tomb of the great Sanusi. I was afraid even the whisper of the Fatha might hurt the silence, for our footfalls were muffled by thick piled carpets, but the man whose mind I had always imagined fixed on things of the earthly, shattered it with a sudden sound, half cry, half groan, as he bent passionately to kiss the rail, and afterwards the hand with which he had touched it. In the morning, after an excellent but peppery breakfast brought by Mabruk, a hatchet-faced slave whom we used to watch running across the square with a bowl into which he poked a surreptitious finger at our door to see if it were still hot, I went again to the mosque and saw other Sanusi tombs. I found the wide white arches had much charm by sunlight, but I never again caught the mystic spirit of the night when the living force of Islam had flamed for a second before my eyes. Yusuf proved an excellent guide to Jagabub. With intense pride, he took us through the maze of college buildings, pointing out the house of each of the Sanusi, Sidi Rida, Sidi Idris, Sayyid Ahmad Sharif, Sayyid Hilal, and Sayyid Safi al-Din, which make a massive block around the white kuba. In the big open square where the pupils of the Zawiya lodged, he announced, "We each of us have a house here. Amar has one, I have one. We can come back whenever we like. It is our own country." Thus, the Zawiyas hold their pupils long after they have gone out to the cities and deserts. The portly Ekhwan, the prosperous merchant, the Bedouin sheikh, or the wandering scribe may turn into the Zawiya where he has been educated, sure of finding a room and a welcome. Even the chance traveler may claim 3 days of hospitality of the Senussi, and the poorer he is, the more generous it will be. We spent 2 days in the high tower above the square, talking simply about simple things with the Ekwan, doctoring some of the students with pathetically inadequate remedies, exchanging the gossip of Kufara for that of Egypt with a few westbound merchants. Then we set out on the last stage of our journey, determining that for once we would travel slowly and peacefully, grazing the camels as we went, riding a little by night for the sheer joy of the stars, and barracking to make mint tea whenever a hatia tempted us with its wood and shade. Fate must have laughed in her sleeve, but no echo of her mirth reached us as we loaded our 4 camels inside the Zawiya walls, or paused beyond the first gird while Sidi Hassan said the Fatha. I only realized that this was the last Arabic blessing that would attend my journey, and I suddenly felt heartsick for the land I was leaving. The white clustered walls, the white Quba behind, stood for the effort we had made, the object we had struggled for, far more than Kufara itself had ever done. Muhammad was really broken down by the journey and unable to come on with us, so with this little land of hope and fear, success and failure, with these winter months of high-pitched excitement and tense endurance, we were losing a friend. An odd pain possessed me as we finally parted in fine whirling sand, and a wind which blew his jerd wildly about his face. And when Yusuf said complacently, "The Set Khadija is happy, she will be in her own country soon," I knew the desert had won after all. Those who are initiated into her secrets are forever held in her thrall. I think my voice was rather wobbly as I answered, No, I am sad because I am leaving the Senussi country behind." So quick is the Arab sympathy, so responsive is their instinct, that Yusuf's face reflected my woeful expression. My heart was touched, he confided to Ammar. I would have wept with the Set Khadija because she has many feelings. There was a strong northwest wind that day, but it was behind us, so we rode slowly and placidly through the distorted country of sand and shale that lies east of Jagabud. I do not know whether sportive giants dig for treasure or young gods build play castles and entrenchments in that desolate land, but on every side rise fantastic shapes of wind-blown sand. Reddish layers drip over polished white bases that look like chalk. Ridge after ridge of storm-polished girds shut one into a maze of strange hillocks that give way occasionally to welcome green of hatias. The retinue had shrunk to 3, Yusuf, Ammar, and a new guide, one Abu Bakr Manfi, who looked exactly like the wicked caliph in Dulac's illustrations of the Arabian Nights, for he had a huge beaked nose which, under an immense loosely rolled turban, curved to meet his pointed beard and nutcracker jaw. His curious eyes were forever asking questions, but his dialect was almost beyond my comprehension. We proceeded very slowly because all the camels were tired and the retinue had surreptitiously added to their loads immense earthenware jars to fill with oil at Siwa. But it did not matter, for this was a friendly desert, generous of her wood and water. We halted at El Amra, where the Mahdi had built 2 great cisterns some 50 feet long with domed roofs, through holes in which the water drips into the immense chamber below. Abu Bakr made tea with a swiftness suggesting that his caliph ancestor had bequeathed to him the services of his familiar genie. Then we proceeded slowly, walking and riding alternately another 12 kilometers to Makta, where we turned the weary camels loose to graze and cooked our rice and asida, respectively, under a delightfully sweet-scented bush, while inquisitive blackbirds with impertinent white patches over their bills hopped cheerfully around us. In red mist of sunset, we started to reload, noticing that Abu Bakr carefully joined his Asr, Fajr, and Isha prayers into one unending stream in order to avoid having to do any work. A golden crescent lighted a white world as we left the Hatia, laboring through the Sabaka with great dunes looming on our right. I felt infinitely at peace in the shimmering, silvery stillness,
the silence only broken by the soft padded padding of the camels or use of sudden wailing chant in praise of his beloved Quba, white as the breast of a virgin. The desert was in her most magical mood, and I longed to turn south again and ride back into her bournless country by the pale light of Jedi and Suhail. Then a strange murmuring sound arose in the dunes. It was as if a great wind bore the humming of a myriad monstrous bees. "The jinns are awake tonight," said Yusuf fearfully. "Something evil will befall us. They are making a great noise in the sands." I laughed at him and wondered if it were the throb of the breeze reverberating to the empty oil jars, or if we were so near civilization that an aeroplane had become a possibility. Then I remembered the desert drums of the French Sahara, for which no human fingers are responsible, and I wondered if, when one is very near akin to the spirit of the earth, one can hear the beat of her pulse. I turned on my big blond beast to ask Hassanine what he thought of the strange throbbing, and instead of a crouched figure swaying monotonously on the gray tibu, I saw a heap pick itself briskly from a patch of stones. "I think I have broken my collarbone," said a calm, laughing voice. "You wouldn't say it quite so happily if you had," I grunted, with memories of hunting falls. "Perhaps not," replied my companion, clambering back onto his camel. "All the same, there's a most enormous lump. I believe I have." And though the voice still laughed, I grasped suddenly that it spoke disastrous truth. Camels were roughly barracked. Yusuf, for once bereft of speech, stumbled round, mutely offering most of his clothing as bandages. Abu Bekr, practical and brutal, wished to massage the lump as a sprain. I blessed for once the cumbersome length of the red hesam. Bandages and sling it made at the same time, and left an end over to fix a cushion under the armpit. All the time Hassanine was cheerfully explaining that the Tibu had thoughtlessly stumbled just as he was practicing gymnastics in order to extract a blanket from some mysterious recess among the baggage sacks. But we gave him short time for talk. We hustled him into a roughly made basur, and a pitiful little procession started off again, for suddenly the silver night had become desperately lonely, the drumming of the jinns sinister, and the trail to Siwa, with half-exhausted camels and none too willing men, a thing of intolerable length. Thereafter our journey was just the chronicle of a very gallant feat of endurance. The golden sickle died behind us, but we plodded on. No longer were the 85 kilometers in front of us a friendly desert to be traversed slowly and comfortably. At all costs, we must reach Siwa and a doctor before the fractured bone broke the skin and set up mortification. The greatest difficulty was the retinue, who could not believe that the Ahmed Bey, who laughed at them and urged them to sing, could really have a broken bone. "It is a little sprain," said Yusuf hopefully. "We will make a fire and massage it with oil of jasmine, and it will be cured." But I drove them on, unrelenting, till the rough ground west of Kusabea made the camels stumble hopelessly in the darkness. I hated Abu Bekr when he calmly lit himself a fire, and, warming his feet at the blaze, started chanting the Koran in a loud, exasperating voice. We could not get the unfortunate Hassanine into a flea bag, and no position we could devise could give rest to his shoulder, already jarred by the unending bumps and jerks of a camel's pace. All we could do was to pile our cushions and blankets under him and cover him with the sleeping sacks. Yusuf toiled nobly, and in the cold night which followed, during which Abu Bekr was the only one who slept, I heard him come shuffling several times to see if he could help. Never was a dawn more welcome, but as we helped my infinitely plucky companion onto a camel, waiting for no breakfast except coffee made overnight in a thermos flask, I wondered whether human endurance could last out another 48 hours like this. The shoulder was already inflamed and the ground terribly rough, so that every few minutes the rider was jerked and jolted painfully. We passed the blue salt lake of Kusabea, a strip of color on our left, and clambered down into the hatia, where the camels had to be turned loose to graze. We found a palm clump and cooked rice in the shade, and Hassanine's smile grew a little more twisted in spite of my best efforts with bandages and slings. I would hardly allow the retinue to finish their noisy gulps of tea. "What does it matter if you were tired?" I flung at them. "That bone has got to be set tomorrow night." 3.5 days from Jagabub to Siwa," said Yusuf mournfully. "We would walk with you all night, but the camels will not go." "They have got to go," I said sternly, but I knew that our animals were very nearly exhausted. They had come more than 1,000 miles with periods of overloading and insufficient food. For nearly 3 months they had had no rest but the 8 days at Kufara, and we had always hoped to leave them at Jagabub to recuperate. Unluckily, there was not a single beast of burden in the Zawiya to take us on, so we had to pick out the 4 least weary camels and trust once more to luck. That afternoon was one of the longest I have ever spent. When I saw Hassanine put away his compass, I knew that things must be pretty bad, and the fantastic hills were a tortuous maze through which we wandered eternally. Yusuf pointed out the grid, a group of 3 girds which might serve to support the cooking pots of the largest giants. "We shall camp at Zaizeb," he said, and I prayed that it might be near. "Allah alone knows how far it is to that hatia," said Abu Bakr placidly. As we mounted, it seemed to me for the 1,000,000th time, a little rise and saw nothing below but reddish sand over hard white blocks, in monstrous forms that suggested beasts and edibles to the fanciful Amar. Hassanine was the last of us to fall into silence. The sun set without showing any signs of the promised hatia. The camels were obviously incapable of going much farther. Yusuf said pathetically, "I have walked 17 days from Kufara on these legs, and now they are very tired." But Hassanine said nothing. Only when I climbed a huge mound of stones beside the track and saw the hope in his face as I looked across a great expanse of broken country, I could not resist the impulse. "I see the hatia," I lied. "It is quite near." Darkness came as we jolted down into the wadi, and every rolling stone, every sudden drop made me realize that 2 more days of this would be impossible. The swift appearance of the hatia almost justified my impulsive speech, but it was very dark as we barracked behind a convenient mound. I insisted that food should be eaten quickly and that we should then walk till the moon went down. The retinue expostulated violently. "You must leave some of the load," said Yusuf, and Abu Bakr so firmly ensconced himself in his blankets that I thought a concerted mutiny was probable. However, after a forlorn meal, for even my companion's unfaltering courage could not hide his pain, I literally pushed the retinue onto their feet, and by dint of doing half the loading myself, forced them to prepare for another march. Hassanine dragged himself mutely onto the grey Tibu, still far the strongest of the Hamla, but when I saw the party crawl away from our camping ground, I knew that I could not force the pace any longer. On the morrow I would put up the tent and leave my companion there with Yusuf and Amar. I would take the Kufara camel and Abu Bakr, who, for love of heavy Mejides, would guide me in one long march to Siwa, from where I could bring back help. "This is the end," I said to Yusuf. "Pull up your energy." And then, hamdulillah, a dog ran out barking, and figures loomed in the shadows. "Friend," came the answer to Amar's challenge. "No friend walks thus at night," said Yusuf decidedly, and to me, "Get ready your revolvers." But I had heard an English voice. Rushing forward, unheeding of ungirdled Barakan, of Moslem custom, of anything in the world but that the hands of my own countrymen could help us as no other hands in the world, I met a Camel Corps patrol which the Frontier Districts Administration had sent out to look for us. I have absolutely no recollection of what I said to the calm-eyed shadow in khaki who drew away from the dark figures in close-rolled turbans and the precise double row of neatly barracked Hajin, but oh, the efficiency of England! I have railed at her so often and with so much justice. I have run away from her powers that be when I have wanted to penetrate to particularly unauthorized and impossible places, but that night I valued her as never before. In so few minutes the situation changed.
Did I relinquish my command, or was it unconsciously taken from me by beneficent Kaki? I do not know, but the retinue's grumbling sank to awed silence at the power which had leaped to meet us. The Hamla were driven on to camp at a given place, and the swiftest Hijin went back to Siwa, untiring through the night to fetch a doctor and car to Gerba, only half a day ahead. Fate had played against the kindness of an English governor then at Siwa, for the rescue party had camped but a couple of 100 yards from our distressed dinner, and she had lost because the wandering dog had heralded our approach. Otherwise, we might have drifted on into the night. Almost before I realized how life had changed, I found myself on a white trotting camel with a specially immense sheepskin testifying to a very gracious forethought. Beneficent Kaki was beside me, and behind me a swiftly broken camp, the still glowing ashes of the fire, and then a line of dark figures on the slender Hijin of the Camel Corps. It seemed so small a thing now, the distances that lay before us, and even the long trail behind us was suddenly of no account, for we talked of world wars, of nations still in the melting pot. How eagerly I asked for news. Governments had fallen, a new republic had sprung into existence, a famous general had vanished with a great army. Long before I had filled the gap those desert months had made in newspaper knowledge, we had overtaken the Hamla, and beneficent Kaki was looking out for convenient shelter. "The lee side of a gird, I think," he said firmly. "That big fellow over there will do," and he wheeled his tall white beast sharply under the hill. So swiftly the camp was made. I felt ashamed of our clumsy loading, our lumbering halts, when I saw the ease with which each tall Hejin barracked in its own place in the double line. "What a good thing it is to belong to such a government," said Yusuf enviously. "What fine camels, and what a good turnout." There was no grumbling at making a zareba that night. A meek retinue bestirred themselves mightily to little effect, but beneficent Kaki took charge. Marvelously soon, it seemed, Hassanine was tucked into a wondrous flea bag, complete with sheets, a real pillow propped up his shoulder, a thoroughly windproof zareba shut out northern blasts, a fire blazed cheerfully before us, and, as I tugged my own roll of bedding nearer its happy crackling, a voice said reproachfully, "You mustn't do that. Do remember that you've got lots of people to do it for you now." I smiled, for I had almost forgotten the ways of England. "Hot tea," said the same voice, "with milk." And I noticed an enormous kettle on the fire. Mugs came from a magic picnic basket filled with all sorts of good things. Rugs and sheepskins appeared from the spare camels brought for our riding. Was there anything the Frontier District's administration could not produce at a second's notice? Then someone said sausages, and even Hassanine was enthusiastic. We cooked them with tomato sauce on the scented brushwood fire and ate them steaming hot, with white new bread from the hospitable basket, and then how we talked! Beneficent Kaki smoked a pipe, and we, blissfully indifferent to the stern Senussi laws which had forbidden us tobacco for so many weeks, saw visions and dreamed dreams in the blue haze of our first cigarettes. It must have been nearly 2 a.m. when we finally buried ourselves in our flea bags, but no one slept. Hassanine because of his broken bone, beneficent Kaki because he had been too recklessly generous in the disposal of his own blankets, and I because the great adventure was ended. I lay on my back and looked at the stars, weighing the balance of success and failure, and suddenly I felt that this was not really the end. Sometime, somehow, I knew not where or when, but most assuredly when Allah willed, I should come back to the deserts, and the strange uncharted tracks would bear my camels south again. For those who like to know the end of every story, be it said that the efficiency which had taken possession of us did not relinquish its grasp until it had deposited us, bewildered and hopelessly out of place, in the hotel at Alexandria after a 430-mile motor drive from Siwa. It was complete to the last detail. Hot tea steamed beside our flea bags before the dawn brought us out of them. At a pace which would have made light of the long trail to Zakar, we trotted on to the Hatia at Gerba, where, under the largest palm, waited a doctor, complete with aluminum fittings. The cars arrived exactly at the correct moment. The road to Siwa was unexpectedly smooth, and oh, how hot and plentiful was the bathwater at the rest house. There I discarded my worn barracan with a sigh of relief. Yet, as I wandered through the honeycomb of old Siwa, with its close-piled houses one upon another and its labyrinth of dark tunnels that serve as streets, I was ashamed before the gaze of Arabs. It seemed to me intolerable that a Moslem should see my face unveiled. Instinctively, I pulled at my hat brim and my flying cloak, for, curiously, the soul of this people had become mine, and I resented the lack of privacy till I remembered that the Sit Khadijah was no more. Once again we spent a night in the desert, but this time in the shelter of a tarpaulin hung between two FDA cars, which were to take us to Matra, and it was a tame desert with friendly caravans passing and newly sunk cisterns to prove the enterprise of its governor. Yet the silvery moon was the same that turned the Hawari sands to molten amber, scarred with the sapphire of her palms, and I crept beyond the shelter and the comfort to watch the setting of the star that Mohammed had always wanted to put out. "Warm congratulations on your success," said generous-hearted officialdom at Siwa and Matra, and the more than kindly welcome was our best reward. "So you have been to Kufara," said a civilian on the coast. "It is an island, isn't it? But I always thought it was spelt Corfu." Then I met a pretty Englishwoman. The stripe in her skirt matched her French sweater, and faint scent of the millefleurs drifted from her rose-petal skin. My nails were broken, my nose blistered. My only European dress had been hidden for months at the bottom of a sack of bully beef tins. Yet was I sincere when I echoed Hassanein's vicious "civilization, alhamdulillah," as he stuffed his kufia into a corner of his knapsack and pulled out a fez. Dabaa, February 19th, 1921. End of chapter 15. Recording by Stephen Seitel. End of The Secret of the Sahara, Kufara by Rosita Forbes.